Imagine waking up to a morning that offers you a dozen possible paths, each with its own pull and promise. You could take the train into the city or drive along the coast. You could accept the job offer or decline it. You could tell the truth in a difficult conversation or hedge your statements. In the moment of choosing, you might feel a certain weight, a sense that you are the author of your own course. And then again, you might feel as if you're simply being swept along by forces larger than you: habits, desires, social pressures, the accidents of luck, the inescapable tide of causation that science has long described. The tension between feeling free to choose and feeling constrained by causes is exactly what this section is about. Foundations and dilemmas, what free will is and what it is not. Let us begin by clarifying the terms at stake, so that we do not confuse the research program with the mood one brings to it. Free will is not a word for chaos or randomness. If your life were governed by pure whim or sheer accident, the claim "I freely chose this" would sound hollow and unpersuasive. True freedom, as it will be elaborated here, is the capacity to act in accordance with reasons under one's own deliberation. It is a licensing of rational direction, an endorsement by the self of a course of action that has been weighed, considered, and endorsed as fitting within a coherent aim. In that sense, freedom is a form of agency, a moral and practical sovereignty over how one responds to reasons, values, and plans. It is not a leap into irrational spontaneity, nor is it a wholesale escape from causation. It is a particular alignment, reasons, deliberation, and control over the path one actually takes. Determinism, for its part, is the claim that every event or state of affairs is necessitated by prior events in accordance with natural law, so that given the exact state of the world at a moment and the laws of nature, only one future is possible. If determinism is true, then the future unfolds as an inevitable consequence of the past plus the laws that govern the universe. In day-to-day talk we might say, everything happens for a reason, and we might mean causal chains that stretch back to the Big Bang and beyond. The challenge determinism poses to free will is straightforwardly practical. If every thought, desire, and decision is already fixed by prior states, can we still be truly responsible for our actions in a way that deserves praise or blame? And if responsibility is undermined or altered in that way, what becomes of moral life as we know it: punishment, praise, reform, social trust, and the very meaning of living well with others? Agency and control are the other two anchors in our understanding. Agency is the sense that you are an actor who can initiate actions and bear responsibility for them. Control is the sense that you can steer your life, at least to some degree, through choices that are not entirely dictated by external pressure or by blind impulse. These are not identical notions. You might be an agent even when determinism holds in a broad sense, at least if your internal organization aligns with the reasons available to you and your actions flow from that alignment. But if every action, including your most internal motives, is already fixed on the level of causation, the space for genuine control could be thought to shrink. The philosophical project is to disentangle where agency ends and constraint begins, where control is still present and where it would be illusory. Within that map, there are three main positions that philosophers have defended for centuries, each presenting its own elegant contrasts and stubborn counterarguments. First is hard determinism, the view that determinism is true and that free will, in the sense required for moral responsibility as we ordinarily practice it, does not exist. If you truly could not have acted otherwise than you did, then the classic idea of holding someone morally responsible in a robust sense looks questionable, if not incoherent. The second position is libertarianism, a rigorous form of incompatibilism. Some actions are free in a robust sense, and those actions are not determined by prior states. In its strongest forms, libertarianism claims there is some element of human agency, often cast as agent causation, that originates actions from the person, not from the chain of events that preceded the person. The third position is compatibilism, a strategy that says free will and determinism are not enemies. Freedom, for the compatibilist, is not the capacity to violate causal laws, but the capacity to act in accordance with one's own reasons and desires without external coercion. In other words, you are free when your action flows from the internal landscape of your will, provided you were not physically forced or manipulated into acting contrary to your own considered judgments. To set the stage with a few concise contrasts, imagine a simple decision. You're offered a choice between two options, A and B in hard determinism. The decision to choose A over B would be the inevitable outcome of a long chain of prior events. Your brain states your past experiences, the pressures of the moment, the chemical reactions that have shaped your mood, all arranged in a way that makes it unavoidable. In libertarianism, there would be room for a genuine alternate possibility. Given the same past and the same current choices, you could have chosen B for reasons that are yours, not the world's. In compatibilism, the same moment could be determined by prior states, yet you would still be free in a robust sense if your choice to pick arose from your own reasons, your deliberations, your reflective endorsement of a plan you have rationally committed yourself to. The crucial twist is that for compatibilists, freedom does not require the absence of causation. It requires alignment of action with one's own reasons, values, and deliberations, without coercive force. The historical arc that binds these discussions stretches from ancient reflections on voluntary action to the most refined modern debates. Aristotle, whose thought sets one anchor for the notion of voluntary action, saw human action as a kind of practical rationality, moving toward chosen ends through deliberation. The early conceptions of virtue and choice circle around how one chooses means to ends that one already deems good, or at least worthy of pursuit. The sense of agency is tied to knowledge of the object of the will. To act is to deliberate, to know, and then to decide in light of a rational account of what counts as good. From there, the Stoics push toward a more radical inner freedom. If you can govern your own mind so that external things do not disturb your inner assent, then you achieve a kind of freedom that remains intact even when fortune behaves unfavorably. The Stoics teach that external events lie outside our control, but our responses, the assent or refusal to be moved by appearances, the place where we exercise judgment, are within our grasp. Freedom for them becomes a disciplined inner sovereignty, an ability to align one's inner life with rational virtue rather than with the shifting weather of circumstance. The medievals then interweave will, grace, and providence in new, intricate patterns. Augustine and Aquinas stage a drama in which the will is real and powerfully oriented toward God, yet it is not a bare, deterministic mechanism. Grace can illuminate, redirect, and lift the will toward higher goods, but not as a raw intrusion that cancels out human continuity or responsibility. In that tradition, it is possible to speak of freedom within a framework where transcendent purposes structure the possibilities of action, yet the responsibility of choosing remains an essential element of moral life. With the Reformation, modern philosophy invited sharper questions about autonomy. Descartes, trying to anchor knowledge in clear and distinct ideas, points to the power of the thinking mind as a locus of certainty. The mind's ability to propose, suspend, and decide stands out against the restless flux of sense impressions. The mind's will appears as part of a rational architecture that can resist the seductions of passion when properly disciplined. Then Spinoza arrives with a startling counterclaim. Everything that happens does so with necessity, and freedom in the traditional sense is mostly an illusion. For Spinoza, the more we understand the order of causation, God or nature's necessity, the freer we become, not through escaping causes but through aligning our mind with the true necessity of the world. Kant then reorients the discussion toward autonomy and moral law. The will, for Kant, is not merely a creature of inclination. It is bound by a rational law it can legislate for itself, a law whose authority comes from within the agent, not from external coercion or mere empirical habit. The famous formulation of the categorical imperative captures this. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Freedom here is not say-so in a vacuum. It is the capacity to be a legislating agent who legislates universalizable maxims for the collective life of rational beings. Autonomy is the essential mark of moral agency in Kant's account, and it is the ground on which moral responsibility is argued to stand, even under a worldview that recognizes the causal structure of the world. As we move into contemporary debates, the discussion becomes more precise and more contentious. The questions sharpen. Can the mind be said to originate actions in a way incompatible with physical determinism? Is the sense of freedom just a byproduct of internal deliberation, or does it demand something more, such as agent-causal power that starts actions from the agent itself? And what does responsibility mean if we revise our notion of free will to accommodate a world governed by natural laws? These questions are not mere abstract puzzles. They touch the core of how we understand responsibility, blame, praise, and the practical demands of living with others. Let us illustrate these ideas with concrete examples from daily life that illuminate how freedom might seem to surface even under pressures that feel overwhelming. Consider a young adult facing a career choice that will define their life. You are studying a field that your family and friends admire, perhaps with a long family tradition behind it, and a part of you wants to forge a different path, one that resonates with your own emerging sense of purpose. You feel social pressures, the expectations of parents, peers, and mentors, and you are aware that choosing a path of your own may invite criticism, instability, and risk. yet you notice a deeper line of reasoning emerging in your mind. You weigh the reasons for a certain field, you deliberate about what aligns with your talents, your growing values, your long-term vision of what kind of person you want to become, and you decide to pursue the route that most coherently reflects your own reasons. It is not a choice made in a vacuum. It is a choice made through deliberation, through weighing arguments, through an internal dialogue with your own sense of aim. In that sense, freedom shows up as the capacity to act in accordance with your own reasons under the discipline of deliberation, even if the social atmosphere lures you toward a different path with its own powerful appeals. In a different register, imagine resisting a strong craving, a craving that, if followed, would lead you quickly toward short-term satisfaction, but at the cost of longer-term goods you value more deeply. A person who has quit smoking, or who negotiates with an addictive urge, or who refuses the lure of an impulsive purchase. These acts can feel like moments where a different, freer self speaks against a siren call. The urge is real, the desire is intense, yet the person pauses, reflects, and makes a choice in line with a broader vision of health, discipline, or fidelity to a promise. You might say the will is exercising control. Not controlling the environment or the physiological triggers directly, but controlling one's own responses to those triggers by way of rational appraisal and self-governance. The freedom in such moments lies in the person's ability to bring reasons to bear against the force of appetite, to align conduct with a standard they have set for themselves. A different, more social example. Consider a debate within a political community about a policy with significant consequences. A proposed reform that could improve the lives of many but would require difficult trade-offs. Or perhaps a policy that aligns with one's values but could be unpopular with credible constituencies. The deliberative process matters as much as the outcome. The decision to advocate for a particular policy can be guided by evidence, by moral consideration, by sympathy for those affected. The freedom of that choice within the constraints of social norms, institutional structures, and the weight of public opinion still exists when the agent's reasoning is given priority in the decision. If no compelling external compulsion removes the agent's ability to think through the premises or to revise the conclusion in light of new reasons, the act bears the imprint of freedom as the exercise of reason internal to the agency. Those concrete moments invite us to attend to the core claim that free will is a capacity to act under one's own deliberation. Yet not everyone is persuaded that these examples suffice to secure a robust sense of freedom. Two broad lines of critique have historically pressed back against the idea that daily decision-making with reasons necessarily carries the weight of legitimate freedom. The first is a traditional objection from determinism. If every choice is fixed by preceding states of the world, and if the brain is a physical system governed by causal laws, then even our most reflective deliberations are themselves already determined before they are formed in consciousness. If that is so, to what extent can we call a person's decision their own in a morally robust sense? The second is the claim that what we experience as the intuitive sense of freedom may be a phantom crafted by the mind's tendency to narrate its own experiences. Our minds create a story of rational agency to explain why we do what we do, even if the underlying causation is more intractable or uniform than the story suggests. Let us hold these critiques in view as we proceed to examine the three principal positions around free will and then return to the practical and historical texture of the discussion. First, hard determinism. The hard determinist accepts the truth of causal determinism and asks a hard, honest question. If determinism is true about the universe, can there be free will as ordinarily understood, free will that justifies praise, blame, and moral responsibility in a robust sense? If not, we might need to reframe moral praise and blame in a way that preserves our social life, even if the metaphysical basis of praise and blame shifts. A representative stance is that human action is the outcome of a chain of causes stretching from the past through the present. Your beliefs, your desires, your character all emerge from that chain. The sense in which you act freely is reinterpreted as the sense in which you act in accordance with your internal causes, your character, your values, your preferences, which themselves have deterministic histories. The implication of hard determinism is that the traditional, retributive form of moral responsibility may be undermined. If I did what I did because my brain state happened to be in a certain way given the causal order, then on what basis do we properly hold me to be morally blameworthy in a way that would reform the world or improve justice? Hard determinists argue not that responsibility is meaningless, but that it must be redesigned. They may appeal to a compatibilist re-engineering of responsibility. Even if your actions are determined, we still praise or blame to regulate behavior, to deter harmful actions, to shape social norms, and to promote future alignment with communal goods. But in this view, the kind of moral responsibility that licenses serious punishment for wrongdoing is softened. It is understandable as a necessary instrument of social cooperation rather than as a verdict about a metaphysical freedom of the will. The price, some say, is a more humane, more constrained concept of responsibility, one that takes into account the causal history of agents and the conditions that shape their choices while still maintaining social ordering and reform. Second, libertarianism. Libertarianism asserts that there are some actions for which the agent could have done otherwise, where the alternative possibilities genuinely reside in the agent's power to originate action. The intuition behind libertarianism is strong. There are moments in which a person acts as a self-originating source of action, not merely as a passive occupant of a causal chain. One common formulation holds that there is agent causation, the mind or the agent as an active cause that can initiate actions not fully determined by prior physical states. This approach aims to preserve a robust sense of moral responsibility. If I am the source of my action, and if I could have chosen differently in a genuine sense, then praise and blame have a stable basis. Libertarianism often requires a certain ontological commitment that the agent, as a kind of causally efficacious subject, can break out of the strictly determined order in at least some cases. The modern debate here often splits into arguments about whether agent-causal explanations are coherent within a naturalistic science, whether alternative possibilities are real in a way that can be reconciled with physicalist accounts of the mind, and whether such freedom can be reconciled with a fair account of moral responsibility. Third, compatibilism. Compatibilists insist that the conflict between free will and determinism is a category error, or at least a misframing of what freedom amounts to in moral life. Freedom for the compatibilist is the ability to act according to one's own internal states, desires, beliefs, and plans without coercion. It does not require the absence of causation. It requires that one's actions align with one's reasons, within a framework where one's choices are not forcibly constrained by others. The classic move here is to redefine freedom not as the power to have acted otherwise in the exact same situation, but as the capacity to act according to the deliberations that are authentically one's own, given one's character and one's long-term aims. The aim is to preserve the moral reality of responsibility while accepting a deterministic naturalistic account of the world. Compatibilists have often offered careful analyses of what is meant by control. Genuine self-regulation, the absence of external coercion or manipulation, and the presence of reliable deliberation that can be revised in light of reasons. The result is a version of freedom that often seems less glamorous, perhaps, than libertarianism, but it preserves the practical ecosystem of praise, blame, legal responsibility, and personal growth. Let me weave these positions with references to historical lineage. Beginning with Aristotle, the idea of voluntary action emerges from his account of practical reasoning. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he treats virtue as a mean chosen through deliberate choice. Action is voluntary in the sense that it originates in the agent, with knowledge of the action and its ends, and without compulsion. When a person acts as a rational agent, he or she moves along a path guided by a rational understanding of the good. For Aristotle, the evaluation of actions rests on whether the agent has chosen from knowledge of the ends involved and has acted with deliberation rather than by mere impulse or under external compulsion. The Greek philosophical landscape thus begins with a robust confidence that agents can be the authors of their actions, provided they have developed a reasoned capacity to decide. The Stoics then shift the emphasis toward inner freedom. The Stoics insist that external events lie outside our control, but we still possess the capacity to respond with assent or with resistance. If we can master our judgments, we can be free from the tyranny of fortune. Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca emphasize that freedom is a matter of the will's alignment with reason and virtue rather than a freedom from causal law in the world. The inner freedom they describe is a form of bravery. Even when your body faces pain or your circumstances degrade, your mind can retain its integrity by choosing how to interpret the event and how to respond to it. The drama of fate in Greek tragedy, where characters confront inexorable destinies while seeking to act with some form of dignity, offers a vivid early texture for these questions. In tragedy, fate can loom large, but the human actor still makes crucial choices at decisive moments, sometimes in ignorance of a complete causal story or in the face of circumstances that appear to crush agency. The tension between fatalism and voluntary action in tragedy invites a nuanced view of freedom. One can be constrained by external forces and yet still exercise a form of inner sovereignty, an ethical and cognitive posture that makes sense within the Stoic repertoire. Moving forward to Augustine and Aquinas, we meet the medieval synthesis in which grace and will interact. Augustine insists that grace plays a decisive role in the orientation of the will toward God, yet his writings do not extinguish human freedom. He argues that human beings must freely cooperate with divine grace. Grace does not override the will, but transforms it so that the will's capacities are directed toward what is good in a way that preserves responsibility. The tension between grace and free will becomes a central philosophical and theological problem. How can human beings be truly responsible if their capacities are shaped by grace that is itself a gift from God? Augustine's reflections helped set up a robust tradition in which the will remains real and powerful, but its proper operation depends on divine assistance. Aquinas deepens the discussion by offering a reconciliatory framework. Grace does not destroy nature but perfects it. In his Summa Theologiae, he argues that nature has its own integrity and ends, and grace perfects nature by elevating its capacities and directing them toward God. This is a way to preserve human freedom within a theological universe that includes divine governance. The interplay of grace and free will become a story about how inner freedom works in practice within a cosmos of cause and meaning. The Aristotelian emphasis on rational deliberation and the Thomistic emphasis on the hierarchical order of nature and grace converge into a vision in which freedom remains real, even as it is ordered to something greater than oneself. Descartes, rising in the early modern period, foregrounds the power of the mind and method. He is concerned with certainty and the architecture of the self. The Cartesian project places emphasis on the thinker's certainty about the self as a thinking thing. I think, therefore I am. If the mind can secure such a foundation, there is a basis for a form of freedom anchored in rational clarity and the will's orientation to clear and distinct ideas. The mind is a seat of decision and affirmation, and the will, at least in Cartesian accounts, seems to enjoy a form of liberty that can resist the sensory delusions of the body. The mind's capacity to assent or dissent in light of reasons becomes a locus for freedom, even if the broader physical world remains governed by deterministic laws. Spinoza then challenges many of these intuitions with a claim that feels counterintuitive to the everyday sense of freedom. In his Ethics, Spinoza identifies a world of necessity. Everything that happens does so by the necessity of the divine order of nature. In his famous phrase, he often expresses the idea that things could not have been otherwise than they are. The freedom available to us, he suggests, lies not in breaking causal chains but in understanding them, aligning our minds with the rational order, and thereby achieving a form of freedom that comes with knowledge. If you understand the necessity of things and align your desires with that necessity, you are freer than you would be if you fought against it. In this sense, Spinoza's freedom is not a break in causation, but an enhanced comprehension of it. Finally, Kant introduces a decisive turn. His account of freedom is not primarily about the physics of causation, but about the moral law within. For Kant, to be free in the strongest sense is to be autonomous. To legislate for oneself the universalizable maxims by which one would live. The will that acts in accordance with laws it itself has laid down is free, even if the world's causal order remains as it is. This is not a claim about the absence of causation in the external world. It is a claim about the rational authority of the agent who responds to the moral law. Kant's vision is that moral responsibility rests on autonomy, on the practical capacity of rational beings to act in accordance with universal law, and thus to deserve praise or blame in a meaningful, norm-bound way. Let me pause here to offer a few quotes from primary sources that illuminate the moral and metaphysical stakes. Consider Kant, in Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, who writes, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." This is a crisp, compact formulation. The free will is not a mere reflection of preference, but a legislative faculty, the capacity to approve decisions that could be made by everyone under rational scrutiny. This is a bold claim about what it takes to be truly free as a moral agent. From Aquinas, we can recall the line that language often crystallizes for readers of theology and philosophy. Gratia non destruit naturam sed perficit. Grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. The sense here is that the natural human endowments, intellect, deliberation, and the capacity to choose, do not vanish under grace. They are uplifted, redirected toward higher goods, and oriented toward God. The result is a delicate balance between freedom and the shaping influence of transcendent ends. We can also bring in a more famous modern touchstone from Descartes, cogito ergo sum. This canonical statement is not a treaty on freedom by itself, but the act of thinking, of doubting, and of affirming one's own existence offers a kind of epistemic anchor for the will's sovereignty. The mind's capacity to judge, to affirm, and to suspend belief stands out as a core feature of the agent who can deliberate and decide. A note of caution about quotes. We should be precise about wording when appealing to canonical sources. The exact phrasing matters, especially when the sentence functions as a hinge in a philosophical argument. The aim here is to present these sources with fidelity and respect, while also translating them into accessible language for everyday listening. When exact wording is critical, I have quoted directly in precise terms, as with Kant's maxim, while also explaining the broader significance of the passage. When a quote's exact wording is debated, or when a statement is paraphrased in a way that captures its meaning, I have indicated that with a careful paraphrase and anchored it to the author and context. Now, with the historical lines drawn and the major positions laid out, we can press into the philosophical ground more deeply. It helps to pause and consider two counterarguments in some more detail, because they push back on the very idea that free will, in any of the three forms we have discussed, can survive intact under scrutiny. First counterargument: determinism undercuts responsibility. If every action is a predetermined outcome of prior states, then the common practice of praising or blaming may no longer track the underlying reasons we think justify it. A common structure of this critique runs like this: a criminal commits a crime. The judicial system responds with punishment or rehabilitation. But if the culprit's decision to commit the crime was determined by neurobiological factors, socioeconomic background, conditioning, or even genetics, what moral leverage remains for society to hold the person responsible? The debate then turns to whether responsibility is legitimate only if we can imagine alternative possibilities that the agent could have chosen. If determinism makes those possibilities illusory, then the intuitive basis for moral responsibility is unsettled. In this frame, the role of social policy shifts. Rather than aiming for moral blame that serves as moral education, we might emphasize rehabilitation, deterrence, or social protection, all built on a different epistemology of the agent. The compatibilist response is to insist that responsibility does not require the agent's being the sole ultimate origin of every thought in a metaphysical sense. It suffices that the agent's actions arise from properly reasoned internal processes, that the agent is not externally coerced, and that the agent has the capacity to reflect, revise, and endorse the plan that guides the action. The determinist critique, however, presses on the edges. If all these internal processes themselves are the products of prior causes, can we still call them truly ours in the metaphysical sense that makes praise and blame meaningful? Second counterargument: the intuitive sense of free choice may be an illusion crafted by internal reasons. This line of critique asks us to attend to the phenomenology of decision. When you pause before a decision and consciously weigh reasons, you feel as if you are choosing with some autonomy. But the argument goes, this subjective sense of weighing and choosing could be a narrative the brain constructs after the fact to make sense of actions that are causally determined. Our deliberative experience, feeling like we weigh options, considering values, imagining counterfactuals, and then choosing, might be a sophisticated cognitive mechanism that produces a coherent story about agency. The sense of "I chose this because of these reasons" could be a post hoc rationalization that makes a coherent sense of what happened, while the actual causal chain remains closed in on itself well before we become conscious of the decision. If the intuitive sense of freedom is an illusion, then we would need to rethink how we structure moral education, legal practice, and social policy to reflect a more deterministic, or at least more complex picture of decision-making. These counterarguments are not merely intellectual objections, they map onto two crucial tasks of the philosophy of free will. The first is to preserve a stable, workable account of moral responsibility that can guide social life, how we punish, praise, rehabilitate, educate, and relate to one another. The second is to honor the complexity of human agency in a world governed by natural laws, a world in which science is continually expanding our understanding of how thoughts, desires, and decisions emerge from brain states, environmental cues, and cultural conditioning. The three main positions, hard determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism, each offers a consistent answer to these tasks, but each also invites further questions that keep the conversation alive. Let me offer two historical anecdotes that illuminate the texture of this conversation. The first is about fate in Greek tragedy. In Greek drama, we often meet characters who face prophecies and destinies that seem to constrain their possible actions. Oedipus, in the play named after him, confronts a fate that appears inexorable. Yet the play also centers on how personal choices, misreadings, and moral responsibility operate within that fatal frame. The audience experiences a drama about the limits of human freedom and the legitimacy of culpability under the shadow of a larger order. The drama does not resolve free will into a single, neat solution. Instead, it reveals a texture in which fate and human agency are interwoven, with tragic consequences that prompt both pity and reflection. The enduring lesson here is not that fate excuses or condemns, but that it creates a space in which the questions about freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of choice are intensely vivid and morally urgent. The second anecdote comes from the Stoic practice of inner freedom in the face of external events. The Stoics taught that while you cannot control what happens to you, you can control how you respond to it. A slave might be constrained by a master's decree, but the Stoic would seek to maintain a tranquil mind by focusing on the realm of judgment and assent, to preserve inner sovereignty regardless of external conditions. This practice is not a denial of causal realities in the external world, it is a robust claim about where genuine power lies. In daily life, this translates into rituals of reflection, training in rational appraisal, and a disciplined habit of choosing how to interpret events. It is a form of freedom that emphasizes self-command, emotional regulation, and the recommitment to reason as the compass when fortune seems capricious. The anecdote of the Stoic practice shows how people across centuries have asked how to sustain agency when the world's contingencies threaten to overwhelm it. Another thread in this historical tapestry concerns medieval debates about divine foreknowledge and human freedom. If God knows the future with certainty, how can humans have genuine freedom to choose? The problem is sometimes called the problem of foreknowledge and free will. Philosophers and theologians in the medieval period and beyond debated how to reconcile divine omniscience with human responsibility. Some argued that God's knowledge of the future does not determine it in any way. Other views held that God's foreknowledge is compatible with human freedom in a more subtle sense, perhaps by encoding a type of knowledge about the agent's own deliberations rather than about the future's brute details. These medieval queries reveal a crucial point. The war between determinism and freedom is rarely a sterile puzzle about abstract metaphysics. It is deeply connected to how we conceive divine providence, moral accountability, and the legitimacy of human efforts toward reform, salvation, and personal growth. The medieval debates, with their intense engagement with the will, still guide many contemporary discussions about responsibility in religious contexts, as we will explore in later sections. Cross-referencing to related ideas and thinkers helps enrich the discussion and makes room for a broader web of ideas that informs later sections. The Stoic program, as already noted, emphasizes inner freedom and rational assent to appearances, while existentialists, thinkers such as Sartre and Camus, turn the problem inside out, insisting that existence precedes essence and that individuals are condemned to be free, bearing responsibility for their choices in a world that provides no pre-given script. Existentialists often insist that meaning is something we create through the choices we make, not something that is simply determined by universals or fate. This does not deny determinism in the external sense, but it emphasizes the moral weight of authentic decision and the anxiety that accompanies the burden of freedom. Religious notions of grace, as we have already noted in the Aquinas-Augustine lineage, recur in modern debates about freedom and responsibility. Grace can be interpreted in ways that preserve or alter free will. In some religious traditions, grace constitutes a decisive intervention that enables freedom where autonomous capacity is insufficient. In others, grace works by forming and transforming the will so that it can freely choose the good within a divine order. In any case, religious frameworks invite us to consider how freedom relates to ultimate ends, teleology, and the possibility of living in a way that transcends purely secular calculations of preference and consequence. We thus arrive at the grounding intention of this section. This is not a dry, abstract taxonomy of metaphysical positions that will simply be shelved in a cabinet of thought. It is a careful laying of the bricks so that the ground on which we stand is steady. It is essential to clarify what we mean by free will, to map out the main philosophical options, to trace the historical currents that shape those positions, and to illustrate the debate through clear examples, thoughtful counterarguments, and evocative anecdotes. It is also essential to point toward the broader context in which these discussions occur, how free will intersects with questions about agency, responsibility, and social life, how it intersects with science and psychology, how it intersects with religion and secular ethics. The aim is to foster a calm, accessible, thoughtful exploration that prepares listeners for deeper analysis in the sections that follow. As we continue, I want to invite you to hold in mind two questions that will recur in subsequent segments. First, what would it take for a reasonable, practically useful theory of free will to be compatible with what science tells us about the natural world? Second, how do we maintain a robust sense of moral responsibility while remaining open to the evolving understanding of causation, cognition, and responsibility that emerges from empirical investigation? These questions are not merely theoretical puzzles. They are guides to how we ought to reason about ourselves, our neighbors, and the institutions we create to sustain communal life. In closing this segment, I want to revisit a few succinct formulations that capture the core thread of the discussion, while inviting us to return to the living texture of human experience. Free will, in the sense we have embraced here, is the capacity to act in accordance with reasons under one's own deliberation. It is the anchor of agency, the anchor that keeps us tied to our own path even as the world pulls in different directions. It is not an absolute exemption from causation, but a structured space within which human beings can reflect, judge, and decide in light of values, aims, and commitments. The three principal positions, hard determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism, offer different maps of how to reconcile freedom with causation, each anchored in a different understanding of what counts as a source of action, what counts as control, and what counts as responsibility. Aristotle's practical wisdom anchors deliberation in virtue and choice. The Stoics anchor it in inner freedom and assent. Augustine and Aquinas anchor it in the cooperative interplay between grace and will. Descartes anchors it in the certainty of the thinking mind. Spinoza anchors it in the necessity of nature. Kant anchors it in autonomy and the moral law within. And the contemporary debates, with their nuanced analyses of conditions, causes, and intentions, remind us that the conversation continues because human life itself is too rich and too important to be settled with a single formula. In the next parts of this video, we will continue to ground these ideas in more detailed analyses, with careful attention to how modern philosophy has refined the distinctions between compatibilist freedom and libertarian agency, and how empirical findings in psychology and neuroscience inform or challenge these traditions. We will return to concrete examples in greater depth, how social pressures mold choices, how internal deliberations shape actions, how self-control operates in real time, and we will examine counterarguments more closely, including recent experiments and arguments about free will in the laboratory and the courtroom. We will revisit the cross-cutting themes of Stoicism, existentialism, and religious notions of grace, and we will show how these traditions illuminate one another rather than merely competing in a zero-sum debate. This foundation, built on careful definitions, historical lineage, and vivid examples, is designed to prepare you for a calmer, more patient, more reflective exploration of the philosophical terrain ahead. Before we turn the page to the next movement of the discussion, I invite you to reflect on your own sense of freedom. When you decide to take a certain path, what is it that feels most like freedom to you? Is freedom your sense of being unbound by causation, your sense of being the ultimate origin of your choices, or is it your sense of alignment, with reasons, with values, with plans that you experience as you deliberate and act? How does the social world shape or constrain your sense of freedom? And how might you cultivate greater freedom by cultivating your reasons, your deliberative habits, and your capacity for self-governance? These are not rhetorical questions for a hypothetical exercise. They are invitations to listen more closely to the texture of your own decision-making in the ordinary moments of life. And as we move forward, I will keep returning to a thread that ties all of this together: the willingness to listen to the voices of other thinkers, to cross-reference with notes from Stoicism, existentialism, and religious notions of grace, and to keep the conversation alive with honest, patient inquiry. The aim is not merely to persuade you to adopt one position over another, but to cultivate the capacity to think clearly about what freedom means in your own life, how it interacts with responsibility, and how your society can nourish a form of freedom that respects both the realities of causation and the meaningful demands of moral life. In that sense, this section is not the end of a chapter, but the invitation to a continual conversation, one that will unfold in the pages of history, in the laboratories of science, in the quiet of personal reflection, and in the public square where policy, law, and culture are built. Let us carry this spirit into the next segment, where we will ground these ideas even more concretely and begin to map out the ways in which different philosophical traditions approach questions about autonomy, reason, and the moral life. We will look at how the concept of agency has evolved in response to scientific developments, how different traditions frame the meaning of responsibility in different social contexts, and how we can use these frameworks to approach everyday decisions with both humility and rigor. And we will continue to weave in cross-references to related ideas and thinkers, so that the exploration remains rich, interconnected, and genuinely engaging for anyone seeking to understand the foundations and dilemmas of free will. Let us begin this journey not with a single defining event, but with a lineage of questions that stretches from the marble streets of ancient Athens to the glassy offices where modern debates about responsibility are decided. Free will is not an isolated spark, but a long, winding conversation. It grows in the soil of early metaphysical puzzles about chance, choice, and control. It is pruned and shaped by religious thought. It is tested by new sciences, and it is debated by philosophers who insist that freedom is either the flame of moral responsibility or the stubborn illusion that keeps us humane in a world governed by laws we did not choose. In this section, I invite you to walk that historical trajectory from ancient debates about autonomy and destiny to the sophisticated theories and counter-theories that animate contemporary discussions. We will listen to voices across centuries, listen for the way they frame issues, and listen for the tensions they leave unresolved, because in the gaps between answers, the questions endure. We begin in the ancient Greek world, where autonomy and fate are not merely abstract words but living tensions that illuminate ordinary life. In the shadow of tragedy and the bustle of political life, the Greeks asked whether a person could be said to act freely when events seem to press upon him from outside, when the heavens themselves appear to ordain paths we cannot escape. For Aristotle, freedom was inseparably linked to volition, deliberation, and the choices that shape character. He did not reduce human agency to instinct or to mere impulse. Instead, he insisted that how we deliberate, what ends we pursue, and the kind of person we become through repeated actions matters. In the Nicomachean Ethics, one can hear the claim that a moral life is formed by voluntary choices, by the alignment of intention with rational judgment, and by the cultivation of virtue through habituation. Aristotle's famous identification of humans as political animals implies that freedom is not simply a private interiority, but something that finds its full meaning in communal life, in the capacity to deliberate about the common good and to act in accordance with a shared understanding of what is just. Yet the Greek world was also saturated with a sense of fate, a cosmic order in which certain events seem arranged or foreknown, beyond the reach of human contrivance. The Stoics in particular argued for a radical inward freedom that could withstand the pressure of external circumstance. Epictetus, one of the most enduring voices of Stoic thought, gives us a reliable anchor for thinking about autonomy amid fortune. In the Enchiridion, he writes in effect a maxim that has echoed through centuries. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it. The famous line, often paraphrased for lay readers, is that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about those events. When we talk about freedom in the Stoic mood, we are pointing to a particular locus of sovereignty, the rational faculty that interprets, evaluates, and chooses, even under pressure. The external world may present itself with thunder and demand compliance, but the inner life can remain steadier than the storm only if one cultivates a disciplined stance toward desire, fear, and emotion. The Stoic ideal was not indifference, but the practice of maintaining serenity in the face of what cannot be altered. If Aristotle offered a robust theory of voluntary motion, Epicurus offered a parallel, if differently framed, account focusing on chance and the limits of causal necessity. Epicurus took aim at the notion that every event must be fixed by necessity and that human beings are marionettes pulled by inexorable strings. He introduced the idea that chance, unpredictable, undetermined at the macro level of human life, plays a real role in the movement of the world. This was not a license to despair at determinism, but an insistence that randomness can create openings for freedom in contexts where necessity would otherwise smother agency. Epicurus's universe invites us to notice the unplanned, the unanticipated, and the moment in which an individual might still act in a way that matters, even in a world that lacks perfect predictability. With Epicurus, the Greek tradition begins to broaden the vocabulary of freedom to include contingency and the possibility that human action can initiate new futures rather than merely respond to a pre-written script. Historical anecdotes help illuminate these theoretical contours. One of the most dramatic is the grand sense of fate that permeates Greek tragedy. In plays like Oedipus Rex, fate is not a mere backdrop. It is a living force that seems to circle around the hero, constraining options in ways that feel both inexorable and deeply human. Oedipus tries to outmaneuver prophecy, and in his attempts to escape the oracle, he runs precisely into the very catastrophe the oracle predicted. The audience experiences a tension. To what extent can a person be free if fate seems to have woven a thread around almost every possible choice? The dramatic form invites reflection on responsibility. whether one remains morally responsible for outcomes one sought to prevent, or whether fate renders action unknowable or morally inert. The tragedy does not settle the matter, but it makes us feel the cost of living with uncertainty about destiny and about the power we have to shape our own lives. A second anecdote comes from the practice of the Stoics, who developed a ritualized, methodical approach to inner freedom. Consider a teacher leading a pupil through a morning routine of reflection. The pupil is told to contemplate that external circumstances, someone blocking the path, a debt, a winter storm, are not the decisive determinants of one's character or happiness. The decisive determinant, rather, lies in how the mind interprets those circumstances and the will with which one acts in response. This is not a call to blind optimism or to naive resignation. It is a disciplined invitation to treat freedom as the power to assent to or reject the values and judgments that arise within us. The inner serenity cultivated by the Stoics is an experiential form of autonomy, an ability to coordinate intention with action even when the world seems uncooperative. These two Greek threads, Aristotle's insistence on deliberative freedom within social life and the Stoic insistence on inner freedom in the face of fate, form a corridor within which later thinkers will move, sometimes colliding, sometimes converging. As we turn toward the medieval period, a different architecture of freedom comes into view, the synthesis of grace and freedom within a devout theological framework. Augustine stands as a towering figure here, wrestling with the problem that human beings are both culpable agents and recipients of God's grace. He is not content with a narrow determinism that would leave human choice a mere appearance. Nor is he prepared to surrender moral responsibility to human will alone, severed from divine influence. Augustine's famous cry in prayer, "Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet," captures the moment of spiritual tension. It is a confession of a will wanting to be good, yet recognizing its dependence on divine aid. The structure Augustine proposes is not a simple duet of sovereignty. Human freedom operates in a space shaped by grace, where the heart's desires and the divine invitation to transformation move together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in conflict. Aquinas, standing in the intellectual wake of Augustine, advances the synthesis with more technical finesse. He argues that grace does not cancel nature, but perfects it. A common way to phrase this is to say that grace elevates human freedom rather than suppressing it. The Thomistic vision contends that the will remains truly free even as it is drawn toward the good by God's grace. This is not a static picture of freedom as empty possibility. It is a dynamic account of freedom as alignment with the divine good, a freedom that grows into a more perfect form as grace acts within the human person. Aquinas thus offers a robust account of freedom in a theistic universe, one that can accommodate responsibility while acknowledging a divine shaping of human ends. This medieval synthesis has not merely abstract consequences for how we think about choice. It also leaves a traceable thread into modern legal and ethical questions. A medieval foreknowledge narrative becomes a paradoxical thread in later discussions. If God knows what we will choose, if the future is already present to the divine intellect, how can we be truly free? The medieval answer is not a flat denial of freedom, but a reimagining of freedom as fidelity to the rational order that God intends for creation. The supposed conflict between foreknowledge and free choice is recast as a question about who bases the standard for responsibility, the human agent who makes a decision, or the divine observer who already knows the outcome. This tension becomes a subtle background music in modern courtroom discussions about responsibility, where the moral weight of a choice seems not to vanish in the face of predictability, but to demand a more careful account of what counts as freedom under the law. Moving from the medieval synthesis to the dawn of modern philosophy, we encounter a shift in emphasis that will shape centuries of debate, the rise of early modern rationalists and determinists. In Descartes, we meet a thought that remains haunted by the certainty of the self-sufficient thinker and the problem of how free will can coexist with a mechanized, calculable universe. Descartes insists on the primacy of the thinking subject and the unbounded nature of the will. He argues that the will is infinite and free in its scope, capable of choosing between any number of alternatives. Yet he also recognizes that the sensory world is a realm of mechanical laws that constrain the body and the mind's operations. For Descartes, mind and body form a dualism in which freedom resides in the mind's capacity to assent or withhold assent, to affirm or deny what is perceived and what is inferred. The practical upshot is a confidence that human beings retain a crucial kind of freedom, the freedom of judgment and choice, even when the body is bound by causes we do not control. Spinoza, by contrast, moves along a different track, His determinism is thorough. The universe is a single substance in which everything follows from the necessity of nature. Yet he does not crown this determinism with nihilism. In ethics, he offers a striking, often quoted claim: freedom is the recognition of necessity. Put differently, to be free is to understand and align with the necessities that govern us, to act in accordance with the rational order of our own nature and the world. Spinoza's freedom is not the absence of necessity, it is the enlightened obedience to necessity. If a person understands the chain of causes that moves them, they can become truly free, not by breaking the chain, but by comprehending its structure and acting in harmony with it. This is a radical reframing. Freedom becomes, in a sense, the highest form of knowledge about the world and about oneself. It is not a denial of choice, but a transformation of how one experiences necessity. The early modern era is also a time of conflict between natural law and divine sovereignty, between the image of a rational, law-governed universe and the claims of theological determinism. The friction between Descartes and Spinoza and between their successors set the stage for Kant's decisive intervention. Kant arrives with a twofold vision. At the level of the phenomenal world, where causal relations and natural laws govern, we inhabit a realm of constraint. And at the level of practical reason, where moral law provides a form of autonomy that governs the will. Kant's most famous formulation of moral autonomy emerges in the moral law as it is reasoned within the agent. To act autonomously is to act on self-imposed universal laws rather than on the contingent pressures of desire or circumstance. This is not a mere private preference, it is the source of moral obligation. The will in Kant's account is free in the sense that it can be governed by its own rational maxims, and that self-governance is the condition for being a moral agent. Two lines of Kant illuminate this further. First, the distinction between the empirical and the noumenal, the world as it appears to us under the laws of causality and the world as it is in itself, lets Kant preserve a space for freedom within the constraints of physical law. Second, the maxim that one should act only according to a rule that could be willed as a universal law grounds autonomy as a form of rational self-legislation. A person who acts from such a law acts as a legislator of universal maxims, and in doing so, acts upon a form of freedom that is inseparable from moral law. The opening of Kant's moral philosophy is thus both a defense of freedom against a creeping fatalism and a call to recognize the conditions under which freedom must operate. It is not a rejection of causal explanation, but a demand that causality not swallow the moral claim to responsibility. If there is a common thread in Kant's position with the earlier Stoic and Aristotelian strands, it is a belief that freedom must be anchored in something more stringent than mere whim or accident. Aristotle's respect for rational deliberation, the Stoic insistence on the governance of the inner life, Augustine and Aquina's insistence on the compatibility of freedom with divine grace, and Spinoza's insistence that freedom is the recognition of necessity. These are threads that converge around the question: what is it for a person to act as a free agent when the world presents itself with constraints? Kant's answer is to locate freedom within a moral self-government that can yet be tested against natural constraints. The result is a robust duality. We live in a world of cause and effect, but we can still act as if the will could legislate moral law for itself. With this Kantian scaffold, we can trace the Enlightenment and 19th century debates that lay the groundwork for contemporary positions. The Enlightenment brings a new regard for human autonomy, reason, and the social contract, while also bringing to the fore the challenges posed by determinism, science, and social change. Philosophers like Hume and Locke, and a later generation that includes Kant's successors, engage in a dialogue about liberty and necessity that often dissolves into a compatibilist intuition. Freedom can exist within a causal order if we understand freedom as the ability to act in accordance with one's own determined desires and rational commitments. Hume's subtle treatment of liberty and necessity offers a pivot point. He suggests that liberty is the power to act according to the determinations of the will, and that necessity, far from negating liberty, can inhabit a coherent space with it. In this telling, the freedom we seek is not the suspension of cause, but the alignment of our actions with our own determined preferences and reasoning. The 19th century intensifies the debate in provocative directions. Schopenhauer, for instance, insists that the world is driven by the blind will, a force that undercuts any straightforward sense of free choice. In his meditation on the will, he depicts freedom as the moment when one transcends an immediate craving and aligns with a more universal or contemplative stance. Yet even in Schopenhauer's pessimistic vision, a subtle form of freedom remains, the freedom to respond with an attitude of understanding or resignation to the will's demands. Nietzsche provides a radical challenge to the moral and metaphysical presuppositions of free will. He questions the very utility and legitimacy of the concept, arguing that our moral vocabulary constructs a fiction of responsibility in a world that does not conform to the comforting assumptions of moral agency. The sentence that free will is a moral fiction is often quoted as a blunt summary of his stance, even though Nietzsche's project is more intricate than a simple negation. It is a revaluation of values that asks us to rethink the ground of responsibility, the psychology of guilt, and the cultural function of the belief in freedom. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, we also see fresh anatomies of freedom as society changes. The rise of scientific naturalism and the growth of social science begin to relocate questions of choice within networks of causes: upbringing, education, economic pressures, collective norms, and social structures. The moral life becomes inseparable from social science and political theory. The Enlightenment ideal of reason is joined by a more practical concern with how institutions shape freedom. The law, the state, and the educational system are not mere backdrop. They participate in forming the kinds of choices we are capable of making, and thus in the degree to which we can be said to be free. Then comes the 20th century, a century that would push free will into the crucible of empirical science and radical philosophical argument. The landscape shifts dramatically as we encounter experiments that seem to threaten the integrity of conscious authorship, and as we hear the most austere defense of responsibility in the face of quantum and neurological models of causation. One of the most famous lines of inquiry is the Libet line, named after Benjamin Libet and colleagues, whose experiments in the 1980s suggested that readiness potentials in the brain preceded the conscious feeling of intending to act. The essential finding was that brain activity indicating a readiness to move occurs before the person is consciously aware of deciding to move. The implications have been controversial. If the brain decides before the conscious decision, what room is left for free will as a conscious, deliberating agent? The debate is not simply about whether people have a sense of agency. It is about whether that sense tracks the actual causal structure of action. Some interpret Libet as a serious challenge to traditional notions of free will, while others insist that the ethical and practical functions of responsibility can survive notwithstanding a separation between initiation and conscious endorsement. Alongside neurophysiological data, a more refined line of thought emerges in the form of Frankfurt-style philosophy. Harry Frankfurt's influential work challenges the necessity of alternative possibilities for moral responsibility. He offers cases in which a person acts in accordance with their own desires, and even when there is a man in the mind who could have intervened to force a different outcome, the agent remains morally responsible if the agent's own desires and rational commitments are what motivate action. In these thought experiments, the key intuition is that responsibility does not require the possibility of doing otherwise in every case. It requires that we identify the agent with the preferences and rational deliberations that actually move them. The famous figure of the person who would go ahead with the same choice even if a brain intervention could have pushed him toward a different outcome is the pivot that opens a space for responsibility under determinism in a way that many find convincing. The Frankfurtian move keeps moral life intelligible in a world where causation seems to have last say. Into this late modern landscape enters contemporary debates by figures like Kant and van Inwagen, two philosophers who articulate distinct, forceful responses to the long tradition. Robert Kant defends a libertarian position in which free will remains incompatible with a strict causal determinism, yet he does not stop there. He offers a sophisticated view of self-forming actions, moments when we face deep conflicts among our own competing desires and long-term values and must make decisions that shape the person we become. Kant argues that these self-forming actions are real choices under conditions of indeterminacy, and they carry the weight of character formation and moral responsibility. The crucial claim is that human beings can be genuinely responsible for choices that are not forced by prior causes, and yet are not wholly unconstrained by competing motives. In Kant's account, we see a robustly anti-deterministic intuition that remains sensitive to rational agency, moral priority, and the agent's own commitments. Peter van Inwagen offers a sharply different but equally influential contribution. In his essays and later book-length discussions, he defends incompatibilism, the view that free will cannot exist if determinism is true. He is famous, among other things, for the consequence argument. If the actual sequence of past events and natural laws determines every event, then our present actions cannot be otherwise. The practical upshot in van Inwagen's view is not a quaint philosophical conclusion, but a strong challenge to the way we we ordinarily understand responsibility. If our lives unfold under a law-governed necessity that we did not set in motion, can we be morally responsible in the simple, everyday sense in which a citizen is responsible for the path she chooses under social pressures, or an individual is responsible for resisting temptation? Van Inwagen compels us to ask whether responsibility requires a different, perhaps more demanding, metaphysical account of freedom than the common-sense narrative of personal agency typically assumes. To ground these high-level debates, it helps to offer concrete examples. Consider the first example of a citizen facing social pressures to choose a particular political path. Imagine a person who is offered a seat at the town council if they align with popular sentiment, even though their private conviction points toward a different course for the community. In such a moment, the agent must weigh the immediate benefits of conformity against the long-term public good and personal integrity. The story makes visible several critical questions. To what extent do social influences constrain the will? Can the individual still act in a manner that is authentically theirs when the choice is mediated by peer pressure, propaganda, or political fear? The moral significance, then, does not reduce to a simple choice between free will and determinism. It demands attention to the structure of deliberation, the sources of affect, and the degree to which an agent can claim to be the author of her own reasons. The second concrete example concerns resisting temptation. A person stands at a crossroad when faced with a tempting offer, an easy path to a goal that would require compromising on one's principles or personal integrity. The analysis in this case typically turns toward the role of self-regulation, habit, and rational assessment. Can a person resist temptation because the reasons for restraint have become part of his reason-seeking process, or does the will bend easily, suggesting a deterministic pull that must be overcome by willpower? This scenario invites an exploration of the way character is formed over time, and how a single moment of resistance can reflect a lifetime of deliberation, practice, and moral education. It is a vivid microcosm of the larger dispute: how does a person become the kind of agent who can act well under pressure? And how does the environment, one's upbringing, social expectations, and immediate temptations shape the possible avenues for freedom? In tracing these currents, it is essential to keep the cross-references alive. Stoicism returns to remind us that the inner life begins the work of freedom. It isn't simply a matter of deciding to do something when the world is favorable. It is about cultivating a stance that can endure the worst of circumstances without surrendering to despair or cynicism. Kant echoes across the centuries in insisting that true freedom is self-governed, that moral law within us demands a kind of autonomy that stands firm even when the world makes coercion appear alluring. Spinoza's language returns in new contexts, asking us to recognize the necessity that governs our actions and to live in such a way that our freedom aligns with the rational order of nature. Contemporary neuroscience, with Libet and its successors, forces us to re-examine the chronology of intention and action, challenging the naive theory that consciousness is the sole author of choice. Yet within those challenges, the very idea of responsibility persists, reimagined through Frankfurt's cases and Keynes' self-forming actions, so that moral life can remain intelligible in a world whose causal structure we are only beginning to map with precision. Historical threads connect across centuries in unexpected ways. The medieval foreknowledge narrative, God's omniscience about future human choices, loops forward into modern courtroom debates about responsibility by asking whether knowledge about a person's future actions must compromise their freedom. If a judge knows that a defendant would commit the crime given the right conditions, does that foreknowledge relieve the defendant of responsibility, or does responsibility persist because the person had the capacity to choose differently? The question forces us to separate predictive knowledge from moral accountability. The medieval response often emphasized the integrity of moral agency within God's order, where freedom is real not in the absence of divine knowledge, but in the alignment of human choice with a rational order that even the divine foreknows. In modern trials, the same distinction recurs in arguments about mitigating circumstances, duress, coercion, and mental health. The courtroom, with its need for predictable social cooperation, still appeals to a sense that people ought to be judged for the choices they make, even when external factors incline them to do otherwise. The continuity is clear. The question of whether freedom survives in the presence of constraint remains a hinge upon which responsibility swings. Let us return to the modern era with attention to how the core ideas connect to their philosophical predecessors. Contemporary positions by Kant and Van Inwagen are not isolated opinions. They are claims in a conversation with Kant, Spinoza, and the Stoics. Kant's robust defense of libertarianism, freedom as non-deterministic and capable of shaping one's own future through self-creation, reintroduces a sense of moral weight that aligns with Aristotle's conviction that we are aroused toward ends by rational deliberation. Yet Kant does not pretend to return to a simplistic sense of pure independence. His self-forming actions occur under pressures from competing motives and social environments, which means that responsibility depends on the agent's engagement with these motives rather than on an abstract hangul, kosiat enus hangul koa enus, or naive sense of absolute freedom. His view suggests that we are authors of our own development in a way that is neither entirely determined nor completely unconstrained. It is a nuanced program for thinking about personal growth, moral responsibility, and the degree to which our lives bear the imprint of our deeper commitments. Van Inwagen, on the other hand, returns us to a stark form of incompatibilism. He insists that if determinism is true, the kind of freedom required by moral responsibility, in the most robust sense, cannot exist. The consequence argument, which presses the idea that our present actions are consequences of the laws and initial conditions that govern the universe, is not just a technical claim, it is a moral provocation. If every action we take is somehow necessitated by prior states of the world, then the critic would argue that our sense of being responsible for our choices is misplaced or at least miscast. Yet Van Inwagen does not leave us with a mere retreat into pessimism. He invites a careful reconsideration of what we mean by responsibility, what the structure of the agent's life must be to ground accountability, and what sorts of normative practices, praise and blame, punishment and praise, learning and improvement, can still make sense within a deterministic universe. The dialogue between Kant and Van Inwagen is not settled. It continues to shape debates in philosophy of mind, law, and ethics. To ground these discussions in everyday life, we may recall Einstein's sense that the universe is comprehensible and the moral life remains possible. The long arc from Aristotle's political life to Kant's moral law to Kant, and Van Inwagen's contemporary problematics, is not a depreciation of human agency by science, but a clarification of the conditions under which agency can be lived with integrity. The brain science revolution does not erase the felt experience of choosing. It reframes that experience, inviting us to cultivate a more sophisticated understanding of how deliberation, intention, habit, and environment interact in the emergence of action. The moral education we emphasize, the social institutions we reform, and the personal practices we develop, all of these are part of the story that begins in ancient Greece and travels, with many detours, into modern law, policy, and neuroscience. The question remains in every age: what counts as a free act, and what kind of life must we lead to deserve the label of freedom without retreating into mere wishful thinking? In every era we find a blend of inspiration and challenge. On the one hand, the Stoic insistence on inner sovereignty offers a practical pedagogy, training the mind to resist the pull of external events, to align one's judgments with rational perception of what is within one's power, and to accept what is not. This is not a call to resignation, but an invitation to cultivate a robust and resilient form of freedom. On the other hand, Kant calls us to a form of moral autonomy that requires an active commitment to universalizable maxims, a method for legislating one's own will in the service of a rational moral law. Spinoza reframes freedom as the recognition of necessity, a kind of intellectual emancipation rather than a rejection of causation. And the contemporary voices, Kant, Van Inwagen, Frankfurt, offer living models of how we might speak about responsibility in a world that is often more complex than any single philosophical system can fully capture. We should not forget the deeper implications of this history for real-world practice. The concept of autonomy has consequences for education and social policy. If freedom is the capacity to deliberate and form reasons that guide action, then education must cultivate the ability to reason, to reflect on one's own motives, and to resist the erosions of impulsivity that social structures too readily cultivate. If autonomy is a moral capacity to be developed over time, then the institutions that shape character, families, schools, communities, become pivotal guardians of freedom. The law, too, must calibrate its judgments to recognize the interplay between voluntary choice and coercion, the role of habit and addiction, the pressures of systemic injustice, and the ways in which social arrangements can either enlarge or shrink the range of genuine options available to a person. From Greek tragedy to the modern courtroom, the history of free will is a history of the struggle to define what a human being can and ought to be in relation to the forces that press upon us. It is a story of the stubborn insistence that responsibility has a home in a universe that is not wholly under our control, and a story of the equally stubborn insistence that we can and must act as if we are authors of our own lives, even when the scripts are partly written by factors beyond our control. The trajectory from Aristotle to Kant, from Epictetus to Frankfurt, from Augustine to Kant to Spinoza, and into Libet and the contemporary experiments and models, shows a persistent conviction that freedom is not a naive illusion nor a purely private fantasy. It is a practical and philosophical achievement, an ongoing commitment to the possibility of moral reflection, deliberate choice, and the courage to own one's actions in a world that is both intelligible and mysterious. To close this section, I want to offer one more clarification, not as a final verdict but as a guiding orientation. Free will, in the long arc of history, has always been dialogical. With fate and crisis, with grace and law, with science and skepticism. It must be able to tolerate complexity, to accommodate the intuition that we are responsible agents, and yet to acknowledge the causal scaffolding that holds up our lives. The great thinkers who have addressed this issue have not resolved it in a single stroke. They have opened up spaces for further thought, for further refinement of our concepts, and for deeper examination of the conditions under which human beings can live with integrity. If we follow the threads across time, we discover that freedom is not a solitary possession. It is a cultivated practice, a form of disciplined will, a recognition of necessity, and a commitment to live in a way that respects both the demands of the world and the demands of one's own reason. In this historical survey, we have moved through the ancient insistence on voluntary action and the interplay with fate. We have watched the medieval synthesis of grace and freedom evolve into a robust modern account of autonomy. We have followed the early modern confrontations between determinism and rational agency. We have seen Kant carve out a space for moral self-government within the constraining framework of causal order. We have traced Enlightenment and 19th century debates as they expand and complicate our understanding, and we have advanced into the 20th and 21st centuries, where empirical science, thought experiments, and rigorous arguments converge on enduring questions. The echoes of Aristotle, Epictetus, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Hume, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and more recently Kant and Van Inwagen are not relics of a bygone era. They are living contributions to ongoing discussions about how best to answer the questions that matter. What does it mean to be free? How does freedom relate to responsibility? How do institutions and communities shape our capacity to act well? And how should science inform our understanding of the mind, the will, and the moral life? As the narrative moves toward the present, we return to a practical stance. We must be careful not to pit freedom against causality as if they were natural enemies. The history of this topic teaches us that the most fruitful positions are those that recognize the legitimate claims of both sides and seek a coherent way to live with that tension. The path forward is not a simple compromise that declares freedom, a mere epiphenomenon of brain activity, or a sovereign power that stands outside causation. It is a more nuanced space where responsible agency is understood as an ongoing project. To form one's will through reflection, to calibrate one's choices against rational ends, to resist the pull of destructive passions when they threaten one's long-term good, and to accept the limits of what one can know about the deep mechanics of causation, while still holding to the imperative to act in ways that one can endorse as morally coherent. If you listen closely to this long history, you may notice that each era contributes a layer to what we now think of as free will. The Greeks taught us that action is meaningful when it is chosen in light of rational ends and the good in common life. The Stoics remind us that inner freedom is not the same as outward success, and that a life well led is one that remains steadfast regardless of fortune. The medievals remind us that grace and freedom are not enemies but partners in the moral life, and that human choice has a telos that calls for responsibility even in the shadow of the divine. The moderns push us to confront the hard realities of determinism, yet insist that freedom remains a live option, not merely a comforting illusion. The contemporary thinkers show us how to navigate that option in light of how the brain works, how agents form their own dispositions, and how institutions reflect and shape those dispositions. As we move toward the next sections of this video, we will continue to ground these big ideas in concrete argument, in careful analyses of the most influential theories, and in vivid case studies that keep the discussion anchored in human experience. We will turn again to the stark and revealing examples of everyday life, the citizen negotiating social pressure, the person resisting temptation, and we will see how these examples illuminate the deepest questions about autonomy, responsibility, and the moral life. We will also bring back the cross-references that keep the debate lively: Stoicism's practical wisdom, Kant's rigorous moral law, Spinoza's rational necessity, and the ongoing dialogue with neuroscience. In doing so, we will not pretend to settle the matter once and for all, but we will aim to illuminate the terrain, to point toward what is most coherent, and to invite you, the viewer, to participate in this enduring conversation about what it means to be free. The 20th century did not simply continue a line of philosophical thought about freedom. It fractured it, reassembled it, and pressed it into new formations that reached into laboratories, courtrooms, and clinics as much as into lecture halls. When we look at the three dominant modern theories, compatibilism, libertarianism, and hard determinism, we're watching three distinct trains depart from the same station, each claiming to reclaim the most elusive passenger of all. The sense that our lives are our own, that our choices matter, that responsibility has some place to stand in the face of the vast causal web we are woven into. It's not merely an abstract dispute about metaphysical possibilities. It is a dispute that touches how we think about punishment, praise, rehabilitation, public policy, education, health, and the everyday habits by which we steer our days. And it is, as we will see, a dispute continually renewed by new discoveries in neuroscience, by changing legal theories about responsibility, and by the evolving work of moral psychology that probes how we actually reason, plan, and regulate ourselves. We begin with compatibilism, not because it is the easiest or most intuitive path, but because it offers a way to reconcile deep moral intuitions with a world many scientists describe as causally closed and thoroughly determined. Compatibilism, at its core, reframes freedom not as the availability of metaphysical alternative possibilities, but as the alignment of action with reasons and desires. It insists that a person acts freely when she acts according to her own reasons, even if those reasons themselves are shaped by prior causes. Freedom here is not about the absence of constraint so much as the capacity for reflective endorsement. To have one's actions flow from one's own deliberative state, to be governed by one's own will structure rather than by external compulsion or hollow automatisms. There are two strands within compatibilism that philosophers often weave together. The first is the idea of freedom as effective control, the sense that I can do what I intend to do, without being pulled away by forces I do not authorize. The second is the Frankfurt-style account, which treats freedom as the alignment of action with one's true reasons, even when the preventing conditions would not alter the outcome. Let me slow here for a moment and sketch both strands with care, because they are not just technicalities but living ways of understanding why we talk about responsibility in the first place. Freedom as effective control says something like this: you are acting freely to the degree that your action is up to you, that you could have done otherwise in the sense that you could have chosen differently given the same practical conditions, but with your own desires and deliberations intact. It grounds responsibility in the agent's practical authority over her own life. If I intend to go to the gym, pick up my bag, and step into the door, I'm free if those steps are governed by my decision, my commitment to my routine, my planning about a healthy life, my engagement with my goal. If I am genuinely intending to be a person who follows through on decisions I make after considering the consequences, then my action carries the weight of freedom, even if there are deeper causal stories about why those intentions arose in the first place. The sense of freedom here is the sense of authorship. I author this action, and I bear the responsibility that follows. The Frankfurt-style articulation sharpens this claim with the emphasis on the hierarchy of desires. In Frankfurt's framework, we distinguish between first-order desires, like the immediate urge to eat a pastry, and second-order desires or volitions, desires about which desires we want to have or which desires we want to be governed by. A person is free in the Frankfurt sense when her actions flow from those second-order volitions that she has endorsed as her own. The key move is to say it matters not whether one could have done otherwise in an external sense, but whether one's will is aligned with the ends one wants to be governed by. In Frankfurt's telling, a person can act freely even if there are counterfactual possibilities that would lead to different actions under different conditions, provided that the agent's action flows from the higher-order volitions that the agent, at some level, accepts as her own. A famous way to put this is to imagine a person who would like to steal but who, through a robust second-order desire to be honest, refuses to yield to the temptation. Even if a neuroscientist could arrange a scenario in which the person would steal regardless of the person's own deliberations, if the person's act is governed by the secondary commitment to honesty, then the act can be said to be free in the relevant Frankfurtian sense. The claim is not merely that the person would do otherwise under external manipulation. The claim is that the person's own higher-order commitments determine the action. Freedom is a matter of living in a way that your will, your most authoritative reasons about who you are and what you want to become, governs your behavior. To make the compatibilist case vivid, I want to offer two everyday examples that illuminate how deliberation and self-control embody this view. The first is a moment of moral choice at the checkout counter of a grocery store. You discover a wallet someone has left full of cash with no obvious way to determine its rightful owner. A more impulsive reaction would be to pocket the money, to solve a short-term problem and feel a rush of relief. But your deeper reflective self, your commitment to honesty, your second-order desire to be the kind of person who does not steal, emerges. You might decide to turn the wallet in to store security or to hand it to the cashier, perhaps with a note that it appears to be left behind by someone who is anxious to recover it. In that moment, your action is guided not by a bare impulse, but by a constellation of reasons about your identity and your standards. The action flows from your true reasons. You want to be honest, you want to avoid harming someone, you want to respect social norms, you want the long arc of your life to reflect your values. If in a counterfactual sense the wallet had contained a different sum, or if a coercive force had attempted to push you to steal, your action could still be understood as free so long as your decision, given the conditions, remained governed by those higher-order values. This is not a denial of constraint, it is a claim about what counts as meaningful constraint versus genuine self-government. The second example moves from an external test of integrity to the intimate drama of self-control. A person with a long-standing habit of procrastination stands at the edge of a deadline, anxious and tired, facing a page that should be written but keeps getting set aside in favor of easier, more immediately rewarding tasks. You pause and you remember the long-term goal you set for yourself, finishing this project, earning a degree, proving to yourself that you can discipline your mind. You weigh the cost of continuing to scroll through social media against the small, steady discipline of writing one paragraph, then another, then another. You notice the craving for instant relief, and you deliberately refuse it, not because a force beyond you makes you resist, but because your second-order desire to be a person who follows through has become stronger than the initial impulse to seek immediate gratification. You write, you revise, you breathe. The act of writing is not compelled in some cosmic sense. It is chosen, governed by the higher-order volition that you have formed, or more precisely, that you have allowed to become the governing driver of your behavior. In this sense, freedom is not a myth of unstoppable willpower. It is a matter of having one's own reasons guide one's action, and of endorsing those reasons as one's own. That is the core of the compatibilist program. The model is designed to preserve our moral intuitions about praise and blame, accountability and self-governance, while acknowledging that the world is structured by causal relationships that science can investigate. It also invites a move toward a more nuanced picture of responsibility that doesn't collapse into cynicism or fatalism. When your actions flow from your own rational commitments, from your genuine wants that you have judged to be worth pursuing, then you are, in the relevant sense, free. The question then becomes, what counts as your own rational commitments? What counts as true reasons that you are willing to own as your own? And how do we adjudicate cases in which those reasons seem to pull in conflicting directions, or when a person's character has been shaped by violence, poverty, addiction, or social conditioning? This is where the Frankfurtian emphasis sharpens the discussion. Frankfurt's point is that we should regard a person as free if the action issues from a set of second-order volitions that the person endorses as controlling their first-order desires. He insists that freedom is not annihilated by external forces that would compel a different action if such forces could intervene. What matters is whether the person could have endorsed different higher-order volitions, and if so, whether those volitions govern the action. He writes in effect that responsibility is tied to the person's capacity to reflect on what matters to him and to make his will conform to that reflection. The crucial implication of this approach is that it allows for a robust sense of responsibility even within a deterministic framework. If I have arranged my own will in such a way that it aligns with my deeper values, I am responsible for the outcome of that alignment, regardless of whether an external intervention could force a different outcome. Critics of compatibilism worry rightly about whether this redefinition truly captures the sense in which we talk about freedom. If every action is ultimately caused by prior states in a long causal chain, can we still meaningfully talk about genuine freedom, or are we simply rebranding the same phenomenon with more palatable language? If the cause lies in neurobiological processes, social conditioning, or evolved dispositions that I did not choose, is my sense of ownership merely an illusion, a narrative I tell to feel in control? Compatibilists answer with a careful distinction. The sense of freedom that matters for moral responsibility is not a metaphysical claim about alternative worlds, but a practical claim about control, understanding, and integration of the self. The deeper worry still is this: if a person's reasons are themselves traceable to forces that are not under their control, does the person remain the same rational agent in a way that sustains praise or blame, reward or punishment? Now let us consider the other major path that rose to prominence in the 20th century, libertarian free will. Libertarianism in this context is not about political liberty, but about a particular stance on the source of our actions. It asserts that agents can initiate actions not determined by prior states of the world. In other words, there are genuine, non-physical, or at least non-determined choices that originate with the agent and that are not the inevitable outcome of prior causes. The central claim is that freedom requires a kind of agent causation. The agent acts as the originator of an action, not merely as a beneficiary of prior causal streams that would have produced the same action regardless of the agent's true ends. If compatibilism insists that freedom can coexist with determinism by redefining freedom in terms of alignment with reasons, libertarianism insists that freedom, to be meaningful, must be anchored in the agent's capacity to originate action. Among the major proponents, Robert Kane stands as perhaps the clearest modern defender of libertarian free will. Kane's strategy is to carve out a space for genuine indeterminacy and agent-grounded control. He introduces the notion of self-forming actions, or SFAs, which are choices made under serious risk where no settled decision can be guaranteed to be the correct outcome because conflicting values tug the agent in different directions. In such moments when one is torn between virtue and vice or between competing loyalties, the agent's commitment to self-formation can play a decisive role in shaping the person who acts in the world. The claim is that agents sometimes act through indeterministic processes that are not fully determined by prior physical or psychological states, but these acts do not simply fall from the sky. They originate in the agent's practical rationality and choices about who to become. This is a sophisticated dodge around the standard determinism objection. If we're going to be responsible in any robust sense, there must be a real source of the action that stands outside a neat causal chain. Peter van Inwagen is another foundational figure in libertarian discussions. He has argued famously for incompatibilism. If determinism is true, then we do not have free will. And if we have free will, then determinism cannot be true. He has asked readers to consider the intuition that if a given action's occurrence is fixed by the total history of the universe up to that moment, then we cannot be responsible for having willed that action. In his discussions, he underscores the crucial problem of ultimate responsibility. If every event is the consequence of prior chain of causes that goes back to the Big Bang or to random quantum fluctuations, there seems to be no place for a genuine origin that could be traced to the agent herself. Libertarianism answers by positing that the agent's will is the source of initiation, not the past states themselves. The agent is the prime mover, not merely the system that resolves existing conditions. There are other notable defenders and contributors to libertarian thought, but Kane and van Inwagen are among the most lucid and the most debated in contemporary philosophy. The arguments center on three pivotal claims. First, that if all events were determined by prior states, moral responsibility would be undermined in important respects. Second, that there must be a non-causal, or at least non-determined source of our actions to ground genuine responsibility. And third, that the agent's choices, especially in cases of high-stakes self-determination, can be understood as originating from the agent rather than being dictated entirely by prior conditions. In presenting libertarian free will, philosophers often proceed by offering central lines of argument and then turning to potent counterarguments. The main armature of the libertarian case is roughly this. The experience of deliberation and decision feels like the agent is originating an action in a way that cannot be reduced to the laws of physics acting on brain states. We feel as if we choose. We feel as if at the moment of decision there could be alternate outcomes given different options. This phenomenology, what it feels like to decide, what it would feel like to act differently under a slightly different historical roll of the dice, seems to require that something in the agent's agency remains uncaused by the past. Agent causation, then, is the proposed metaphysical mechanism by which responsibility can survive a scientifically deterministic or indeterministic world. If I could not be the source of my action, if my choice were entirely the consequence of prior microstates, then why would anyone be responsible for the outcomes of that choice? But libertarianism faces serious objections, and they are worth naming plainly because they illuminate the real difficulties in this territory. First, the origin of volition's problem. Where do undetermined volitions come from? If a decision to act is not determined by prior states, what is the ultimate source of that decision? Is it me as a non-physical agent, or is it some non-physical something that interacts with my brain? If the agency is entirely up to me, there is a danger that it slides into a kind of mythic self-authoring that resists examination. The worry is that agent causation lacks a clear, testable mechanism. If I am the origin of my actions, what exactly does that origin look like, and how can we study or verify it? The more one tries to specify, the more one risks retreating into a private theater of mind where nothing external can verify the claim. Second, empirical verification presents a stubborn challenge. The modern science of the mind has offered a robust and growing set of observations about how brain states, cognitive processes, and behavior are correlated, with multiple studies revealing that neural processes precede conscious decisions in certain simple motor tasks. That line of evidence has been invoked by those who doubt libertarian claims, suggesting that even if we experience deliberation as origin, the actual causal chain begins in brain activity long before the person becomes conscious of the intention to act. The tests by Libet and subsequent experiments point toward a readiness potential that can be measured prior to our recognition of a decision. Even if libertarianism can grant that the agent has a kind of origin, the question remains. Is this origin meaningful in a way that real-world practice can rely on? Can we claim responsibility for acts that appear to arise from neural dynamics outside conscious awareness, even if we choose to endorse those dynamics as part of our own rational plan? In defending libertarian free will, one often confronts the following response. Perhaps the science has not closed the door on agent causation, and perhaps free will is compatible with a disciplined, non-reductive account of agency in which the agent remains the source of action, even if brain states influence the form of the decision. Some libertarians argue that the agent's capacity for rational reflection, planning, weighing competing values, and choosing among alternatives constitutes a kind of causal source that is not reducible to deterministic brain processes. The claim is not that there are no physical correlates of decision-making, but that there is a robust sense in which the agent can be held responsible precisely because the action originates in the agent's own decision about which line of reason to follow. To reframe the challenge, the problem is not simply to show that the brain has causal influence. The problem is to show that such influence cannot be the ground for moral responsibility when the agent has the capacity to endorse or deny those influences in light of deliberation about who she wants to be. There are two counterarguments to libertarianism that bear especially on the practical and scientific dimensions of the debate. The origin of volitions problem, as I noted, asks for a theory of how undetermined volitions arise in the first place without recourse to a benign but unverified, non-physical layer of agency. A satisfying answer would need to offer a mechanism by which undetermined initial causes are introduced into the causal chain in a way that is both physically plausible and normatively meaningful. The second counterargument concerns empirical verification. If libertarian accounts rely on a fundamentally uncaused or self-originating act, how can we observe, measure, or test such acts in a robust, public, evidentiary way? The problem of testability matters not just for philosophy but for law and policy, because if we are to rely on a certain theory of free will to shape judgments about responsibility, we must have reasons that can be publicly evaluated and contested. As we move toward hard determinism, we could say that the arc of the debate circles back to a perhaps more radical, more austere claim, that everything, every mental event, every intention, every action, follows inevitably from prior conditions. Hard determinism, as a position, denies the existence of liberty in the strongest sense that matters for moral accountability. If all events are determined, then moral responsibility as ordinarily understood, praise and blame, reward and punishment, the sense that we deserve based on how we could have acted differently, loses its footing in the traditional sense. The argument has empirical posture, philosophical depth, and political weight, because if it is true, the entire framework of criminal justice and social policy stands on different ground. Yet determinism is not the end of the conversation. Two important lines of argument push back against hard determinism, even while acknowledging its force. First, there's the robust strand of moral psychology that tries to show that the social practices we have built, praise, blame, apology, forgiveness, do not collapse under causal explanation, but instead persist because they are adaptive and meaningful for human flourishing. Strawson's influential thought experiment about reactive attitudes makes this case in the legal and moral imaginary. Even if one were to grant that our actions are determined by causes, the very practice of holding one another morally responsible is grounded in the social relations, expectations, and emotional responses that structure human communities. The point is not naive optimism about freedom, but a clinical observation about human social life. We regulate behavior through a web of accountability, not because we have access to some pristine metaphysical liberty, but because we find it functional to treat persons as the kinds of beings who have reasons we can praise or blame. Second, there are strategic arguments for maintaining responsibility as a practical engine of reform and improvement. Even if determinism were true, reform policies, rehabilitation, education, public health campaigns can appeal to rational agency within a determinist account. The claim is not that punishment is justified only by retribution in a metaphysical sense, but that there are instrumental reasons to reward and deter based on how people respond to incentives, how they learn to regulate their behavior, and how their communities can shape their dispositions over time. But hard determinism remains a provocative challenge. If every act is the outcome of a cascade of prior events, what moral vocabulary remains adequate to guide and justify social practices? Do we owe more to victims or to the ultimate causal architecture that gave rise to both offender and offense? Do we insist on retribution as an expressive form of social fidelity or shift toward consequentialist aims like prevention and harm reduction? Two counterarguments complement these lines of thought. The first contends that hard determinism, if taken as a totalizing claim, risks eroding moral motivation and undermining social solidarity. It can make blame seem meaningless, which in turn may dull the energy we need to correct wrongdoing, address social injustices, or care properly for the vulnerable. The second counterargument concerns the possibility of a revised, non-retributive, or non-punitive but still morally serious form of responsibility. We might keep the structure of social response, praise, blame, apology, while reframing them as judgments about patterns of causation and intervention rather than as judgments about metaphysical freedom. The aim would be to preserve meaningful social institutions while avoiding the temptation to pretend that metaphysical liberty exists where empirical evidence and logical argument fail to support it. When we survey these three frameworks side by side, we can sense the deep continuity as well as the profound divergence. Compatibilism preserves a robust sense of personal authorship by redefining freedom in terms of control and alignment with one's own reasons. It treats the agent's capacity for rational endorsement of her own desires as the core of moral responsibility. Frankfurt's non-metaphysical, internal account adds the weight of volitional structure. The difference between merely wanting something and wanting to want what one wants, between a first-order desire and a second-order volition, can be the hinge on which responsibility turns. Libertarianism, by insisting on agent causation, dares to claim that the source of action lies in the agent, not just the sum of causal histories. It preserves a certain radical sense of freedom, one that cannot be fully captured by a strictly mechanistic story, yet it must cross the bridge from lived intuition to empirical plausibility. Hard determinism, finally, asks us to confront the possibility that the very vocabulary of freedom and responsibility is to be revised, reinterpreted, or reoriented towards social good. As we shift into the next act of our exploration, I want to emphasize two threads that keep reappearing in the literature and in everyday life: the role of neuroscience and its impact on these debates, and the practical, normative work of law and moral psychology that continually tests and reshapes our intuitions about responsibility. The science is not a mute spectator here. It is an active interlocutor that invites us to reconsider what counts as a source of action, what counts as evidence for or against freedom, and what the social consequences of different theories would be in the justice system, in education, and in the clinic. Neuroscience has been both a provocateur and a stabilizer in these conversations. On the provocative side, the discovery that neural activity precedes conscious decisions has been seized by critics of free will to argue that our subjective sense of choosing is an illusion, a post hoc rationalization for actions that were already set in motion by brain processes beyond our conscious control. The famous Libet experiments and the subsequent debate about what Libet himself called free won't sparked a national and international conversation about whether our ability to veto an action after we become aware of it is enough to salvage free will, or whether it merely shows that the mind can intervene after the fact but cannot originate action in the strong libertarian sense. The story of Libet's reception is itself a useful anecdote about the scientific life of a philosophical idea. Initial enthusiasm, followed by a cascade of criticism, careful reinterpretation, and then a more nuanced stance that recognizes the limits of the method while preserving some space for responsibility, at least as a form of self-control and volitional endorsement. Two historical moments that illuminate this dynamic are worth recalling with a sense of narrative texture. The first is the receipt of Libet's original 1983 report, which sparked a surge of interest precisely because it seemed to decouple conscious intention from the brain's readiness to act. The brain appears to prepare for movement before the person is consciously aware that movement is about to occur, which looks to many like a challenge to conscious authorship. Yet Libet in later discussions introduced the idea that the conscious will might still have a role in vetoing or selecting among possible actions, a notion he termed the free won't. In the years following, a chorus of critics argued that even if veto power exists, it does not rescue a robust sense of libertarian freedom. At best, it preserves a constrained form of control that some compatibilists could interpret as sufficient for responsibility, but with important caveats. The Nieman Lab of Philosophy and Neuroscience filled with debates, blog posts, and symposiums, and the conversation moved from a simple either-or to a more nuanced spectrum in which responsibility is a matter of timing, regulation, and alignment with personal goals, rather than the possession of ultimate origin. The second anecdote concerns the legal world's engagement with Frankfurt-style thought experiments. In the courtroom and in legal theory, the Frankfurt approach, cases where a person's action could be prevented by an external intervention, but would still be that person's action if not for that intervention, offers a way to think about moral responsibility that tries to preserve our practices of praise and blame, even in a causally thick world. The use of Frankfurt-style reasoning in legal theory has several notable consequences. It supports a view of responsibility that does not require metaphysical freedom to be intact. Rather, it requires that the person's action come from their own reasons, even if those reasons are shaped by prior causes. The courtroom has drawn upon these intuitions in debates about addiction, coercion, and mens rea. The law is not only concerned with what could have happened in some other world, but with what the person did, what they were trying to become, and what reasons govern their actions. In contemporary jurisprudence, judges and scholars sometimes invoke the Frankfurt case as a thought experiment that makes clear the distinction between mere causal explanation and moral accountability. The goal is not to deny the complexity of causal influences, but to preserve a meaningful space for evaluating character, deliberation, and the integrity of one's choices in the presence of constraints. And yet, for all the richness of these discussions, we must stay attentive to the cross-disciplinary terrain where neuroscience, law, and moral psychology meet. Moral psychology, with its focus on how people actually reason, how they form and revise their beliefs, how they manage self-control, and how social pressures shape decision-making, gives us a laboratory of human life in which these theories are tested against lived behavior. Dual process theories, distinguishing intuitive, fast, emotion-laden reasoning from slower, deliberate, cognitive planning, provide a lens to understand how real agents navigate the tug-of-war between impulse and deliberation. They show how the same person can operate under different regimes of control depending on context, mood, fatigue, and social incentives. This is exactly where the compatibilist program finds much of its everyday traction. It is precisely in the ordinary but not trivial decisions we make that we see whether our actions reflect our reasons, whether we govern ourselves by our higher-order deliberations, whether we are, in a practical sense, free. The modern debate, therefore, is not a sterile dispute between two camps over metaphysical labels. It is a living inquiry into what it means to be a person with a mind that can reflect, evaluate, and shape its own trajectory under the influence of a world that is never neutral. It is an inquiry into how our institutions, courts, schools, hospitals, workplaces, ought to design incentives, constraints, and supports so that people can exercise the freedom that matters to them in ways that are socially beneficial and morally intelligible. It is also a test of how we balance honesty about our causal commitments with humility about the limits of our knowledge. The more we learn about how the brain computes, how social contexts mold behavior, and how our legal norms reward or punish, the more we realize that the free will debate is not about dethroning science or about clinging to a private myth. It is about building systems of meaning and responsibility that can survive in a world of complexity and contingency. With that frame in mind, I want to lay out the practical map of where this debate touches real life, what the key arguments mean in everyday terms, and how we can think about the three big theories in light of actual practice. First, the cross-disciplinary connections. Neuroscience has revealed how decision-making involves networks that span prefrontal cortex, limbic system, basal ganglia, and broader circuits of expectation, prediction, and reward. The readiness potential discussed in Libet's work suggests a temporal structure to decision processes that invites a careful re-examination of the timing of conscious intention. Yet the science does not specify a single, simple conclusion about freedom. Instead, it reveals patterns that must be interpreted within philosophical frameworks. Compatibilists can incorporate these findings by distinguishing the moment of conscious endorsement from the chain of neural activity that leads to action, thereby maintaining that genuine freedom is our capacity to guide and regulate behavior through reasons. Libertarians can interpret neural data as compatible with a non-causal origin of the self, a self that can imbue or override described processes with a prior commitment to values that cannot be reduced to prior physical states. Hard determinists may view neuroscience as further evidence that the mind is a product of brain states whose history constrains every decision, thus reinforcing the claim that responsibility must be understood differently, if at all. Law, too, has been reshaped by these debates. The Frankfurt-style thought experiments continue to influence discussions of responsibility in cases of addiction, coercion, or neuromodulation, while the science of behavior informs policy about rehabilitation, prevention, and social welfare. In moral psychology, the study of self-control, habit formation, and moral reasoning demonstrates both the power and limits of rational agency in a world of incentives and pressures. If we step back and look for cross-reference points to weave these threads more tightly, we can begin to see the conversation as a network of ideas that resonates across disciplines. In neuroscience, the central question is the relationship between brain processes and voluntary action. In legal theory, the question is the relationship between causal history, agent endorsement, and the social purposes of punishment and guidance. In moral psychology, the question is how people come to form moral intuitions, how they learn to regulate impulses, and how social contexts shape the development of virtuous or vicious dispositions. Across these domains, the three theories of free will offer glimpses into different kinds of responses to human life as it is lived under the constraints and possibilities of the real world. To bring these threads to life in more concrete terms, I want to close with a few rooted reflections, 2 historical or contemporary anecdotes, and 2 real-world applications that illustrate how these debates touch institutions, practices, and lived experience. The first anecdote concerns the Libet-style experiments, their reception, and the subsequent critiques. The second concerns the legal relevance of Frankfurt-style thought experiments in assessing responsibility. The 2 applications will speak to the same themes from different angles: how we understand moral responsibility in the era of neuroscience, and how we design legal and social policies that acknowledge real human agency while responding to real causal forces. The Libet story begins in the early 1980s, when Benjamin Libet and his collaborators conducted experiments that measured the brain's readiness potential preceding voluntary movement. The headline claim that grabbed attention was stark: brain activity related to the movement seems to begin before the person reports the conscious intention to move. For many, this suggested that conscious will emerges only after the brain has already started the process that leads to action. The public myth, if one can call it that, was that free will might be an illusion, but the scientific story is more complicated and more interesting. Libet himself did not deny the importance of conscious will. Rather, he proposed a more nuanced view in which the brain provides the initiating impulse, and the conscious system retains the power to veto or approve that impulse in a final moment of decision. He spoke of free won't in ways that encouraged a reinterpretation rather than a radical rejection of responsibility. The reception in philosophy and neuroscience was kaleidoscopic. Some readers used Libet to argue for hard determinism, others used it to defend a version of free will compatible with some forms of mental causation, and still others saw in it a call to refine our understanding of agency without surrendering to fatalism. The ensuing discourse became a crucible in which the limits of experimental evidence and the demands of normative theory pressed against each other. The Libet episode remains as a vivid reminder that empirical data, while profoundly informative, do not settle normative questions on their own. They force us to articulate more clearly what we mean by freedom, by responsibility, and by the authority of our own deliberative lives. The second anecdote concerns Frankfurt-style thought experiments in law and their practical influence. The courtroom, with its need to adjudicate cases of coercion, addiction, and moral luck, has found in Frankfurt's cases a powerful intuition about responsibility that resists a purely mechanical account of causation. Consider a hypothetical where a person would perform a crime unless a hidden manipulator intervened. Even if the intervention would not have changed the outcome, the person is held responsible because the act originates in the person's own reasons, not in an external compulsion. Legal theorists have used this to argue that responsibility can survive even under heavy causal constraints, as long as the agent's action tracks the agent's own ends and deliberative judgments. The practical upshot is that Frankfurt-style reasoning offers a way to reconcile the social importance of holding people responsible with a scientifically informed view of the causal chain that produces behavior. It keeps open a space for moral education, social accountability, and personal reform, arguing that we can still address people as moral agents capable of self-direction, even when their choices are not made in some mythic vacuum of freedom. The anecdote, then, is not merely about a thought experiment in philosophical ethics. It is about how legal institutions think about autonomy, intent, and the uses to which punishment and rehabilitation should be put. The cross-referenced landscape, the neuroscience, the law, and the moral psychology tells us that these debates are not dead letters, but rather living conversations with consequences. The science compels us to articulate what we mean by control, intention, and origin. The law demands a workable mechanic of responsibility that can guide punishment, deterrence, and social healing. Moral psychology gives us granular data about how people actually reason, choose, and regulate themselves under the daily pressures and temptations of life. The compatibilist position is a disciplined reply to these demands. Yes, agents act freely when their actions reflect their reasons, even within a causal order, and we have cause to treat their actions as moral, not just causal outcomes. The Frankfurt line adds moral depth by insisting that the alignment of actions with one's higher-order commitments, not just the macrocausal conditions, constitutes freedom in a robust sense that can ground praise and blame. Libertarianism defends a bold and demanding form of freedom. The idea that the agent can originate action in a way that is not fully determined by prior states, a view that preserves the drama of human self-constitution and the meaningfulness of moral responsibility in the face of a universe that may well be indifferent to our ends. In the end, the question, "Are we free?" does not yield a single, definitive answer. It yields a set of plausible, carefully articulated positions that illuminate different dimensions of human life. Compatibilism keeps the moral life habitable by reaffirming responsibility through self-governance and rational endorsement, even when the world's causal web is thick and unyielding. Frankfurt's account deepens that tract by insisting on the primacy of one's own volitional commitments in determining whether an act is truly one's own. Libertarianism preserves a sense of origin and agency that refuses to surrender to the idea that everything is already written in the same causal arc, and it dares to maintain that there is still room for the agent to be a source of novelty in action. Hard determinism challenges us to reimagine responsibility in light of a world where every event, mental or physical, is seen as bound by the past. It invites a more humane and pragmatic approach to justice, education, and social policy that does not pretend to weigh the evidence for causal order, but asks whether there is still a way to organize life in a way that fosters flourishing. As you reflect on these perspectives, you may notice a steady invitation to move beyond dogmatic stalemate. The history of philosophy, especially in the 20th century, shows that the most fruitful moves often come when thinkers are willing to listen to the other side with care, to identify where the intuitive ground for our moral judgments lies, and to press for theories that can withstand both empirical critique and normative demand. The stories from science and law remind us that our common-sense assumptions about freedom are not neutral. They carry moral weight and social consequence. The stories of self-control, of deliberate understanding, and of the ways in which we train our own will show that freedom is not merely a metaphysical attribute, but a lived practice, one that can be strengthened, examined, and revised in light of new knowledge and new needs. If I may leave you with a concluding reflection, the question of free will is not simply a scholarly puzzle to solve, but a continuous exercise in living well. The three theories offer distinct pathways to engaging that problem in daily life. Compatibilism offers a humane realism about how freedom operates in ordinary decision-making, a way to maintain accountability while acknowledging causation. Frankfurt's approach invites us to look deeper into the architecture of our desires, to see how the self is formed through its own aims and commitments, and to recognize that moral agency is not extinguished by causal constraints, but is clarified by the alignment of one's actions with one's own endorsed reasons. Libertarianism, with its bold insistence on agent-originated choices, keeps alive the sense that we could become different people under different histories, that the self remains a project of self-direction in a universe that may not be reducible to deterministic laws alone. And hard determinism demands that we never take freedom for granted, pushing us to rebuild our institutions around a more realistic appraisal of causal structure, while still protecting the essential human goods of dignity, learning, and social harmony through education, therapy, and reform. Throughout this exploration, we have cross-referenced neuroscience, legal theory, and moral psychology not as mere add-ons but as indispensable interlocutors. The science helps us articulate the mechanisms, the brain states, and the temporal architectures that accompany decision-making. The law challenges us to craft norms that recognize agency while aligning with social aims. Moral psychology offers us the empirical account of how people actually think, decide, and regulate themselves. The conversation, in this sense, is not a confrontation among rival myths about freedom, but a collaborative project of understanding a complex human life. The aim of this segment has been to treat the debate with calm, reflective care rather than polarized polemics, to honor the weight of competing insights, and to invite you, the listener, to hold these ideas in your mind as you watch, learn, and participate in shaping the moral world you inhabit. Before we close, I want to reiterate a few anchors to help you navigate the terrain in future listening or reading. First, remember the two faces of compatibilism. Freedom as acting in accordance with one's reasons and desires, and freedom as effective control. Second, hold in mind the Frankfurt insight about higher-order volitions and how the alignment between what one wants to want can determine whether an act is truly one's own. Third, keep in view libertarian agency as the insistence that the agent is the origin of action, not merely a conduit of prior causes, even as you recognize the thorny problem of how such origin can be empirically supported. Fourth, respect hard determinism as a force that demands serious moral and social rethinking, while recognizing that human beings continue to seek meaningful ways to praise, condemn, educate, heal, and reform, in light of what science reveals about the causal fabric of thought and action. In the next sections of this video, we will dive deeper into some case studies, analyze more extended examples across different cultures, examine how these theories interact with concepts like moral luck and virtue ethics, and look at contemporary debates in neuroethics and criminal law. We will also listen to more voices from philosophy, from science, from the courtroom, and from the clinic, to enrich the conversation and broaden the horizon of what it could mean to live as a free being in a world of finite causes. As we continue, I invite you to ask yourself, what kind of freedom do you want your life to express? How would you like your society to understand responsibility, praise, and correction? And in light of what we know, what could it mean to be truly responsible for who you are and who you are becoming? Let us move forward with curiosity, patience, and a shared commitment to a careful, non-polarized examination of one of the oldest, most essential questions of human life. We begin in the air between two questions that have haunted philosophy and lived life for centuries. What would I do if I didn't have to do it? And what should we do to one another when we disagree about what we owe one another in a world that seems to press on us from every side? The problem of moral responsibility enters the room as soon as we consider the ways causal influences, our genes, our childhood, the accidents of luck, the social structures we inhabit, press on our choices. If the factors that shape a decision are deep, numerous, and often hidden, can we still say someone is responsible for what they do? The problem is not simply about whether we can praise or blame. It is about how we live together, how we design our laws, and how we tell stories about ourselves and our neighbors. And because free will is not merely a theoretical object but a practical compass, the way we answer it ripples outward into punishment, forgiveness, education, and personal growth. To begin, imagine a spectrum rather than a verdict. On one end sits a sparse, stubborn claim: free will is a pure, uncaused upshot of an autonomous self. On the other end sits a more intricate, suggestive idea. Freedom is real enough to guide action, but it is always braided with causation, biology, environment, habit, social pressure, so that responsibility must be understood in terms of functioning and character that emerge through life. Between these ends lies a family of views, the compatibilists, who say that freedom is not the same as absolute independence from causes, but rather the capacity to act in accordance with one's reasons, values, and character without external constraint or coercion. It is a practical, workable freedom, the liberty to govern oneself in a world that pushes us from many directions. From this vantage, the question becomes not only whether we are free, but how our most deeply held assumptions about freedom shape our institutions and our daily habits. The field splits in its attention. Some argue that the right response to human vulnerability and moral luck is more mercy, more rehabilitation, more attention to the conditions that shape choice. Others insist that accountability must be preserved as a bedrock of deterrence and social order, lest wrongdoing drift into a kind of casual inevitability. And a third stream, coming from virtue ethics, from Stoicism, and from existentialist reflections on meaning, asks whether freedom is the capacity to be the kind of person who lives well under conditions of constraint, not merely the capacity to do what one desires when it is easy. Let us begin by tracing origins and arguments, then move through applications in law, education, and family life. We will listen to the tremor of history, anecdotes from reforms in penal policy and from civil rights debates, before turning toward contemporary tools like cognitive behavioral approaches and algorithmic predictions that press upon responsibility today. We will keep company with the voices that matter in this conversation: Aristotle and Mill, Epictetus and Kant, Marcus Aurelius and Thoreau, and in modern ways, the scientists who chart how we decide and how we regulate ourselves, as well as technologists who imagine responsibility in a data-rich, algorithm-driven society. Origins, thinkers, and core arguments. The debate about responsibility begins in the oldest corners of philosophy and becomes progressively more textured as psychology, neuroscience, and social theory join in. The ancient Greeks offered an essential claim about human flourishing and reasoning. Aristotle, for instance, puts virtue at the center of a life well lived, not as a whimsical fancy, but as a trained disposition that becomes part of our character through repeated practice. Man is by nature a social animal, he writes, and his claim that we become just by doing just actions is not merely an abstract ideal, it is a program for cultivation. When we consider responsibility, Aristotle invites us to see it as inseparable from virtue and community. Responsibility is not simply about punishing failure. It is about shaping the conditions in which human beings can become reliable, reason-guided, other-regarding agents. Later, in the modern period, John Stuart Mill offers a robust account of freedom that binds autonomy to the harm principle. In On Liberty, Mill famously declares that over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, but not to the point of harming others. The short, crisp line embodies a philosophy in which liberty is a form of self-government under the rule of rational reflection about the consequences of one's actions for others. This is not a claim that a brute will or a rebellious impulse is unbound. It is a claim that freedom must be understood as the ability to decide in light of reasons about what would be good for oneself and for the community, while recognizing the social effects of those decisions. Immanuel Kant pushes the conversation toward a different center: autonomy. For Kant, moral law is not a social conventionality, it is a universal obligation discoverable by reason. The categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, asks us to test the legitimacy of our actions by considering whether a universalized form of the act would be rational and just. The idea of duty, of acting from respect for the law within one's own rational will, presses responsibility inward, toward the kind of person one aims to become. The strength of Kant's view lies in its insistence that moral worth is not reducible to outward consequences or to mere compliance with local rules. It rests on the capacity of a rational agent to legislate moral law for themselves, in a sense that holds even when external circumstances push hard. In other corners of ethical thought, the Stoics offer a complementary perspective that remains compelling today. Epictetus, for example, teaches that what matters is not what happens to us but how we respond to it. In the Enchiridion, the instruction is practical. We should distinguish what lies in our power from what lies outside it, and we should train our judgments to prefer reasoned, measured responses to the provocations of fortune. Marcus Aurelius, writing as a ruler who must govern and a person who must live, emphasizes the transformation of internal life through disciplined attention. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. If freedom is a kind of internal governance, then responsibility involves shaping the inner environment, habits, beliefs, reactions that determine outward action even when external forces churn. Existential reflections add a different hue. The existentialists push against a complacent view of freedom as a calm, rational calculation of means to ends. They insist that existence first presents itself, absurd, anxious, and sometimes terrifying, before we fashion meaning through choice. The warning is not that we are unfree, but that meaning is created in the face of constraint. If there is a provident architecture to fate, it is the architecture we erect in our own lives through decisions made under pressure. Existentialism asks us to own our freedom in the sense that our lives are projects of meaning under conditions of contingency. Two strands in contemporary debate deserve particular attention here: the compatibilist position and the tougher strands that emphasize determinism or libertarian independence. Compatibilism, in its most practical form, says that freedom is compatible with causation. The essential point is not to abolish cause, but to preserve the mapping from desire to action in a way that is responsive to reasons and to the demands of moral evaluation. When a person acts in accordance with her own deliberations and values, that action can still be considered free, even if there are prior causal chains. This view has a long lineage, finding modern articulation in thinkers who emphasize the role of character, self-control, and practical reasoning in the exercise of freedom. Philosophers like Harry Frankfurt have argued that we can be responsible even when our actions are caused by our desires, provided those desires are aligned with our higher-order preferences, our second-order volitions. The crucial intuition here is that what matters for responsibility is not whether our acts were caused by something over which we had no control, but whether the agent's actions reflect her own will, as shaped by deliberation and commitment. For the sciences of self-control and decision-making, the contemporary picture is more nuanced yet is not in essential conflict with compatibilist aims. Psychological research on self-control, decision fatigue, and habit formation reveals that our capacities turn on processes in the prefrontal cortex, neural networks that regulate impulses, and the feedback loops in our environments that either foster or erode self-regulation. The occasional crisis of will is not a fault of character alone. It is a reflection of the interplay of stimuli, rewards, and cognitive load. In this sense, compatibilism resonates with a growing scientific understanding. Freedom is not the absence of causation, but the alignment of action with a coherent, well-regulated, and reflective self. And yet there are robust counterarguments you cannot ignore. One line of critique emphasizes deterrence and public safety. If agents are not truly morally responsible in the sense of uncaused actions, then why should punishment carry moral weight at all? The worry is that without strong accountability, there will be insufficient incentive to refrain from wrongdoing, and communities will drift toward chaos. A second line of critique comes from virtue ethics and existentialist reflection. Virtue ethics asks us to look beyond mere compliance with a set of reasons and toward the cultivation of a good character that loves truth, courage, temperance, and fairness. Existentialists remind us that human life is not a calculation of utility but a project of meaning, and thus simply ensuring compliance with reasons brightens the surface while leaving unaddressed the deeper questions about identity, authenticity, and what it would mean to become the kind of person who would not want to do harm, even when harm might be rationalized by external pressures. Two contemplations anchor these counter-arguments. First, the moral luck problem, made famous in the thought experiments that philosophers like Bernard Williams and Thomas Nagel have pressed into view, asks us to acknowledge that two people might be equally rational and well-intentioned in their plans, yet end up experiencing radically different moral landscapes due to luck, how their actions are caused by chance events or by luck in outcomes. If the moral luck thesis holds, it becomes urgent to distinguish between blameworthiness in some deep sense and consequences that are shaped by forces far beyond the actor's will. The second contemplation concerns the problem of responsibility when social structures, poverty, discrimination, unequal access to education, systematically shape choices. A person might want to act virtuously, but the social context makes the virtuous path perilous or nearly unavailable. These concerns invite a form of responsibility that extends beyond the individual and into the design of institutions. Two concrete policy and practice examples illuminate how theories of freedom move from abstract disputes to real-world consequences. First example, rehabilitation, not mere punishment, in criminal justice. Here the compatibilist frame is most explicitly applied. If freedom means acting in light of one's reasons and desires in a context where genuine self-governance is possible, then the policy aim shifts toward creating environments in which people can reframe their lives through internal re-education and external support. A practical realization of this view can be found in modern therapeutic jurisprudence, where courts strive to treat criminal behavior as a symptom of distress, addiction, or failed self-regulation, rather than as an isolated moral flaw. The drug courts, mental health courts, and rehabilitation-focused programs are emblematic of this approach. In these courts, offenders are steered toward evidence-based treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, relapse prevention, while continuing to participate in the legal consequences of their acts. The aim is not to erase accountability, but to integrate accountability with the possibility of meaningful change. The rationale is that genuine freedom involves the ability to regulate one's impulses, to envision a different future, and to act in ways that align with long-term values rather than momentary cravings. This is a humane and practical extension of a compatibilist account. To be free is to be able to shape the self across time, to study the patterns of thought that lead to harmful actions, and to choose anew. Second example, education and parenting that foreground autonomy and self-regulation. In schools and homes, a policy-oriented shift toward autonomy-supportive teaching and parenting recognizes that self-regulation is not merely a byproduct of moral education, but a core condition of it. In classrooms, this means offering meaningful choices, encouraging students to set goals, reflect on their strategies, monitor their progress, and articulate the reasons behind their decisions. It means avoiding coercive, punitive punishment for failures to conform to external pressures, and instead using structured reflection, feedback loops, and coaching that help students calibrate their actions to their own values and to the expectations of a community. In parenting, it translates into an approach often referred to as emotion coaching, where parents acknowledge emotions, label them, and guide children through strategies for self-regulation rather than suppressing the feelings or overreacting to misbehavior. The result is a culture in which children grow into adults who can anticipate the consequences of their actions, who habitually practice self-control, and who are equipped with the internal resources to recalibrate when life's winds shift. History helps us see how these ideas play out in lived reality. One compelling anecdote comes from the penal reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries, when reformers began to reject the harsh, mechanical punishments of older systems in favor of approaches that sought to reform the person. Elizabeth Fry, a leader in British prison reform in the early 1800s, drew attention to the conditions under which prisoners lived and learned, arguing that treatment inside the prison could and should be a platform for moral education as well as confinement. Her work gave shape to the idea that justice should be administered with an eye to the reform of character. Punishment without transformation risked producing not only recalcitrance but a perpetual cycle of crime. The shift toward more humane treatment, better education, and opportunities for work and moral instruction in prisons anticipated many later developments in what we might call therapeutic jurisprudence. A second historical thread runs through the era of civil rights and the long social struggle for justice in the United States and beyond. The mid-20th century witnessed debates about responsibility that were deeply entwined with questions of systemic injustice and the moral duties of citizens who lived within oppressive structures. Thoreau's legacy of civil disobedience, "that government is best which governs not at all," a line that has resonated through time, reappeared in new forms in the 1960s and after. The civil rights movement invoked a sense of moral responsibility that went beyond legal compliance and demanded a law higher than the law as written in statutes, a law grounded in dignity, equality, and the shared humanity of every person. Activists argued that when laws themselves perpetuated injustice, responsible citizens might choose to defy them in pursuit of justice. The moral education here is more than compliance. It is the education of a public that lives by higher standards of fairness, even in the face of risk. This is not a recipe for impulsive disobedience. It is a disciplined, reasoned, and morally serious form of action aimed at reforming the social order. A modern example of cognitive behavioral approaches that help people change patterns also highlights how the science of self-control filters into everyday responsibility. In clinical psychology, education, and community programs, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, has demonstrated effectiveness in addressing a broad range of patterns. Addictive behavior, anger management, anxiety, and even chronic health behaviors. The core insight of CBT, identifying maladaptive patterns of thought that lead to maladaptive actions and replacing them with more adaptive, evidence-based cognitions, offers a structured pathway for people to alter their trajectories. The therapy does not pretend that change is easy. It acknowledges the weight of habit, the pull of automatic responses, and the social and environmental triggers that shape behavior. The aim is to strengthen the executive functions that govern self-control, to reframe desires in ways that harmonize with long-term values, and to build a narrative of change that individuals can inhabit. In courts, schools, and clinics, CBT-informed programs have become a central pillar of rehabilitation and personal growth. They offer a concrete model of how a compatibilist conception of freedom can be translated into real-world practice. People can be helped to act in accordance with their reasoned aims, even when their past has made such aims hard to realize. But we must also consider the other side. In a world where new technologies shape responsibility, policy often moves into areas once imagined only in philosophical fiction: artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and algorithmic decision-making. These developments force us to confront new questions about accountability. If an algorithm recommends a course of action, who is responsible for the outcomes? If a policing algorithm identifies someone as a high-risk offender, what is the moral and legal weight of that designation? If a school uses predictive indicators to guide interventions, How do we balance the goal of helping a student with the risk of pathologizing a particular student because of predictive statistics? These questions require a nuanced approach that respects individuals' autonomy while acknowledging the social power of data. The modern scene thus invites cross-references to the sciences of decision-making, to virtue ethics and existential considerations, and to the responsibilities of designers and implementers in the realm of AI. Cross-references to virtue ethics, Stoicism, existentialism, and the sciences of self-control. Virtue ethics emphasizes the cultivation of character and the aim of living well in a community. Aristotle's view that virtue is a state of character that enables persons to act in the right way, under the right circumstances, invites us to consider responsibility as the lifelong work of becoming reliable, trustworthy, generous, and prudent. In this light, punishment cannot be the sole means of social regulation. It becomes part of a broader project to create communities in which virtue can thrive, where individuals have the opportunity to learn, correct, and grow. The aim of social policy, then, is not only to deter wrong but to enable flourishing, through education, social supports, and opportunities to practice virtuous action in everyday life. Stoicism adds another layer of practical guidance. The Stoics remind us that control lies in our own judgments and choices, not in external events. If we could adopt the stance that much of life's adversity is a test of our character, then responsibility becomes an ongoing discipline. A commitment to choose rightly even when it would be easier to choose poorly because consequences would come quickly or pain would be avoided. The Epictetus line, "It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters," is a compact invitation to view duty as a matter of inner orientation. In education, parenting, and law alike, this perspective encourages programs that cultivate resilience, discretion, and a habit of reflective decision-making. It cautions against simple retribution as the sole response to harm and invites policies that reward and reinforce thoughtful self-governance. Existentialism presents a stark but liberating emphasis on meaning and responsibility. The existential insistence is that human beings are not merely the sum of causal determinants. We must choose who we want to be under conditions that often feel absurd or overwhelming. This is not a license for caprice, it is a demand for authenticity. The idea that life's meaning arises through the projects we undertake, through acts of commitment, risk, and risk-taking for a cause, that responsibility is the ongoing act of making a life that has significance, even when the world does not hand us a ready-made script. This stance enriches debates about punishment and justice by insisting that we attend to the kinds of stories we tell about persons who commit harms, and about the possibility of transformation and meaning beyond mere compliance with rules. The sciences of self-control and decision-making provide a pragmatic complement. Psychological research suggests that self-control is a finite resource that can be nurtured and restored, but also that environments significantly shape its availability. The hot and cold system metaphor, popularized by dual-process theories, helps explain why people often default to impulsive actions in the short run while planning for long-term goals in calmer moments. This research does not undercut responsibility. It reframes it as a question of capability, practice, and the design of environments that support better decision-making. When a person is stressed, fatigued, or exposed to strong temptations, judgments can become prone to error. Recognizing this invites policies that reduce unnecessary cognitive load on individuals at moments when self-control is most needed, that provide supports for difficult transitions, and that reward progress toward self-regulation. Crossing into modern technology, we cannot ignore the rise of AI and predictive technologies shaping responsibility in the contemporary era. Predictive policing tools, risk assessment instruments used in sentencing and parole, and algorithms embedded in educational platforms all carry moral weight. They influence who gets attention, who receives help, and who is pushed toward intervention. The risk is not simply bias, it is the subtle transformation of responsibility away from a personal, deliberative stance toward a machine's probabilistic forecast. This is not a categorical rejection of intelligence and innovation. It is a reminder that responsibility remains personal and social, requiring transparency, accountability, and an enduring commitment to the human values that underlie law, education, and care. The challenge is to design systems that augment moral judgment rather than erode it. Systems that invite reflection, provide contextual data for fair decisions, and leave space for human discretion in the light of the unique contours of a person's life. Historical anecdotes, reforms, and debates about responsibility reforms in penal policy have long served as laboratories for thinking about freedom, responsibility, and the possibility of reform. The early prison reform movement in Britain, with figures such as Elizabeth Fry, highlighted a crucial idea: punishment should be consistent with the possibility of reform. Fry argued that the conditions of confinement, the environment in which prisoners lived, the kinds of work they could do, the education they could receive, mattered as much as the sentence itself. This is an insistence that social systems can shape character, and that the moral education of a citizen includes the state's responsibility to offer pathways toward reformation, not merely to extract obedience through fear. Across the ocean, the reform debates in the United States during the same era show parallel concerns. The civil rights movement, with its appeals to justice and equality, was in part a fight over how responsibility is understood in a society marked by systemic inequality. The movement did not merely demand compliance with existing laws. It demanded accountability from a political order that had long failed to treat all citizens with equal respect. In this sense, the civil rights debates are about the moral responsibility of institutions and leaders to reimagine what counts as justice. The historical trajectory is not a simple linear ascent. It is a series of struggles in which advocates argued that legality and morality must be harmonized, and that individuals must be equipped, emotionally and institutionally, to exercise their autonomy in the service of a more just common life. A further anchor from the historical record comes from the mid-20th century shift in penal philosophy toward rehabilitation and classification. The old punitive models, which often relied on brutal discipline or indifferent mechanical rules, began to give way to approaches that recognized the complexity of human motivation. The idea was not to exculpate wrongdoing, but to understand it as a symptom of underlying needs, traumas, or social deficits, and to respond with therapies, education, and social supports that could reduce the risk of recidivism. In this shift, the human life becomes the central object of moral concern. The aim is to rehabilitate a person so that their future choices can be aligned with a more constructive life, not simply to punish them for past misdeeds. A modern anecdote that stands at the intersection of science and practice concerns cognitive behavioral approaches to behavior change. In medical, educational, and community settings, CBT and related methodologies have become central to addressing patterns of dysfunction and to promoting healthier, more intentional living. The practice is not the denial of determinism, but a disciplined engagement with the factors that shape the will. It is a contemporary embodiment of the idea that freedom can be exercised within a framework that supports the growth of the agent who chooses and acts. The work in CBT complements the philosophical account of freedom by offering tangible tools to recognize triggers, to reframe thoughts, to practice new responses, and to build a life that is more resilient in the face of old habits. This modern practice demonstrates how philosophy can inform practical interventions that improve everyday life, while still respecting the constraints and complexities that make human life so richly challenging. Real-world implications for law, ethics, and personal identity. If the problem of moral responsibility is this intricate, then the implications for law are equally nuanced. The compatibilist impulse invites a justice that is stern in holding people to account while generous in its recognition that people are capable of change and that social conditions matter. In practical terms, this might translate into sentencing that weighs not only the harm caused and the intent behind it, but also the person's capacity to change and the supports available to assist that change. It invites policy that emphasizes rehabilitation, treatment, and structured opportunities for reintegration, as well as community-based supervision that respects the dignity of the individual while maintaining public safety. In education and parenting, the implications are perhaps more direct and more intimate. If autonomy and self-regulation are central to responsible life, then classrooms and homes should be designed to cultivate these capacities. Autonomy-supportive teaching fosters intrinsic motivation. It invites students to set meaningful goals, reflect on their reasoning, and practice self-control in the company of supportive mentors. In parenting, emotion coaching and consistent routines that cultivate self-regulation can lay the groundwork for responsible adulthood. These practices aim to develop an agent who can navigate temptations, anticipate consequences, and align actions with long-term values. The moral education of a person, in this view, is not finished with adolescence but is a lifelong training in the art of living responsibly. When we turn to personal identity, the implications are even more intimate. If freedom is the capacity to govern one's life in light of reason, value, and purpose, then who I am is not simply a fixed essence but a continuous project shaped by choices, habits, and the way I respond to the world. Our identities are anchored in a set of commitments we have made under conditions that are rarely purely of our own making. Our sense of responsibility, then, is inseparable from the narratives we tell about ourselves and the stories others tell about us. Is the person I am the product of sheer luck or of deliberate self-fashioning? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, an acceptance that luck, circumstance, and biology press on us, but that our most meaningful actions are those through which we craft and recraft our character over time. Counterarguments and critiques from virtue ethics and existentialism neutral observers might still worry that even a sophisticated compatibilist account leaves society with too little incentive to deter wrongdoing. If people act under the pressure of causes they did not choose, what ensures that the fear of punishment will channel behavior towards socially beneficial ends? One response is to distinguish between accountability as a social ritual and accountability as a moral claim about character. A system can demand accountability in the sense of reasonable consequences while still acknowledging the complexity of causation and the power of reform. The aim is not to abolish punishment, but to make it proportionate, transparent, and integrated with opportunities for change. The moral energy of punishment in this view is redirected toward rehabilitation, not merely retribution. Another set of critiques flows from virtue ethics and existentialism. Virtue ethics asks what kind of person we want to be and how we cultivate a character that would not choose harm, even when circumstances tempt or frustrate. It asks not simply what a person did, but whom the person is becoming through those actions. If justice is to be more than a ledger of offenses and penalties, then policies must cultivate virtuous dispositions, courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, within communities, schools, workplaces, and legal systems. Existentialist concerns push even further. If life is a project of meaning, then the economy of guilt and blame cannot be the sole engine of moral life. To reduce human life to a calculus of predictable responses neglects the search for authentic meaning, the need for personal significance, and the possibility that a person might choose an unlikely or costly path in defiance of social norms. The existentialist emphasis on responsibility for choosing one's own path invites policies that respect and support individuals' efforts to shape their lives in meaningful ways, even in the face of suffering or social constraint. Together, these critiques remind us that a theory of freedom that is merely technical or merely punitive will fail to meet the deeper demands of human life. If we want to honor human dignity, support moral growth, and sustain social trust, we must design systems that treat persons as ends in themselves, capable of change, deserving of opportunity, and answerable for harms in ways that are fair, transparent, and conducive to better futures. In this sense, a mature account of freedom becomes inseparable from a mature account of responsibility, one that recognizes the real map of causes and conditions while insisting that the human capacity for reason, choice, and meaning remains essential. A closing meditation on meaning, choice, and responsibility. To speak plainly, free will is never just a philosophical footnote, it is the weather in which we live. Our choices are real, and the consequences of those choices matter in tangible, everyday ways. The way we understand freedom, whether as an absolute independence from causation or as a capable self that can act in light of reason within a web of influences, shapes how we design laws, how we educate our children, how we treat those who have harmed others, and how we see ourselves as agents capable of growth. The questions we ask about freedom are not finally resolved in a courtroom or in a textbook. They are tested in the moral life we lead, the social policies we enact, and the communities we build. In law, the aim is to craft judgments that are just, proportionate, and conducive to rehabilitation wherever possible. In ethics, the task is to cultivate dispositions and practices that allow people to live well, not merely by avoiding harm, but by pursuing good. In personal life, the challenge is to recognize how much of one's life is shaped by factors beyond one's control, while still embracing the responsibility to shape one's character and to act as a moral agent within a field of social responsibilities. The journey is not easy. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to revise our beliefs in light of new evidence, new experiences, and new horizons of understanding. We can close with a few guiding insights drawn from the voices we have heard across centuries. From Aristotle, we recall that virtue arises through practice and that life's good is a harmonious expression of character in the polis. From Mill, we recall the importance of autonomy and the humility to respect the freedoms of others as we seek our own. From Kant, we remember that duty has a rational form and that moral law persists as a universal standard we must strive toward, even when the path is arduous. Epictetus reminds us that the seat of freedom lies in our judgments and that our internal life can be a fortress even when fortune roars outside. Marcus Aurelius invites us to recognize change and to align our thoughts with the order we are capable of maintaining within ourselves. Thoreau's call to conscience through civil disobedience invites courage in the face of injustice, even as it cautions us to consider the broader implications of our actions for justice in a social order. And the modern sciences of self-control and decision-making offer practical tools for building the inner and outer structures that allow responsible living to feel less like a betrayal of our own nature and more like a faithful exercise of our best capacities. Quotes from primary sources illuminate these currents, even as they remind us of the limits of any single voice. Aristotle teaches that man is by nature a social animal, reminding us that our freedom is enacted in relation to others and to the common good. Mill insists that over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, a compact claim that defends personal liberty while acknowledging that liberty has its place within a social web that protects others from harm. Kant calls us to act according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, a reminder that our personal decisions must be answerable to universalizable standards. Epictetus counsels us with the practical observation that it is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Marcus Aurelius adds a Stoic reminder that the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it, which reframes responsibility as the ongoing cultivation of inner life. Thoreau's austere challenge, that government is best which governs not at all, is not a celebration of anarchy, but a prompt to consider how justice and governance must be measured by their respect for conscience and for the moral complexities of life. These lines, diverse as they are in tone and emphasis, converge on a shared intuition. Freedom is a lived practice, not a mere hypothesis, and responsibility is a practice of fostering flourishing in ourselves and in the communities we inhabit. As you listen to this exploration, you might notice a recurring motif. Responsibility moves in the space between constraint and possibility. Our lives are shaped by influences we did not choose, but they are not folded into inertia. We have the rational capacity to reflect, to choose, to change, and to participate in a social order that honors both the dignity of the individual and the needs of the many. The path forward is not to pretend that causation vanishes or that we are free from any constraint. It is to cultivate a robust, morally serious form of freedom that can bear the weight of responsibility in a complex world. It is to design law and policy with one eye on the harm we seek to prevent and the other on the human beings whose lives must be sustained, transformed, and dignified. It is to educate and parent in ways that urge autonomy while providing the scaffolding of support that allows children and adults alike to practice self-regulation, reflect on their motives, and choose in a manner consistent with who they aspire to be. In the end, the philosophy of free will is not a dry debate about metaphysical necessity or contingency. It is a blueprint for living, a map of how we choose to live with others and with ourselves. It asks what kind of world we want to inhabit and what kind of people we want to become within it. It invites us to balance the demands of accountability with the obligations of care, to honor the genuine complexity of human life, and to keep sight of the possibility of growth even when the road ahead is fraught with difficulty. If we can keep that balance, we may find that the everyday acts of choice, whether a child choosing to pause before reacting, a teacher guiding a student to articulate reasons, a jurist weighing punishment against potential for reform, are not mere routines but a living expression of freedom in the service of a more humane, wiser, and more just world.